The call had come in at 11:47 p.m. Dispatch flagged it as a vehicular trauma with possible gunshot involvement, ETA 4 minutes, 2 patients. Standard language. The kind of language that made everything sound manageable until the sirens got close enough to hear. Mar Ellison was at the nurses' station on the east wing of Callaway Regional Medical Center, finishing a medication reconciliation form when the radio crackled. She capped her pen, checked the clock out of habit, and walked toward the trauma bay without being told. That was how she worked. Not because anyone expected it from her. She'd been at this hospital 14 months, and most of the staff still introduced her to new residents as one of our night shift nurses. A descriptor so incomplete it was nearly fiction, but she'd stopped needing recognition to function a long time ago. The trauma bay was prepped by the time the ambulance pulled up. IV lines primed, the crash cart unlocked, suction ready. The overhead lights repositioned the way she liked them, angled slightly left to cut shadow on a patient's left flank. 2 of the night shift techs followed her in. A third appeared a minute later, breathless, pulling on gloves. "What are we looking at?" the tech, Danny, 22 years old and still flinching at blood, asked. "Chest wound coming in unstable. Possible tension pneumo." Mara was already pulling the thoracic tray into position. "Get the 14-gauge needles out, and don't touch them until I ask. And someone call Dr. Weston. He's not on until he's on call. Call him." She looked at Danny directly. "Now." He moved. Outside, the ambulance reversed hard into the bay. The paramedics were already narrating before the doors fully opened. Male patient, early 50s, gunshot wound right chest, entry above the 5th rib, no confirmed exit, blood pressure 64/40 and still dropping, oxygen saturation at 81 and falling. He'd been talking at the scene, stopped talking 6 minutes ago. They pushed the gurney through the doors and Mara moved to the patient's right side, already listening with her stethoscope. Left lung, clear. Right lung, nothing. She straightened. "Tension pneumo. Danny, 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Now." Behind the paramedics, a second man walked through the doors. He had no business being there. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that hadn't been bought off any rack in Decker Falls, Montana. He was pressing a folded handkerchief to his right hand. A minor laceration, nothing. And his eyes moved across the trauma bay, the way eyes move when the person behind them has spent years walking into rooms and immediately cataloging everything wrong with them. "His name is Raymond Foss," the man said. His voice was the kind of voice built for boardrooms. Controlled projection, no wasted volume. "He's a senior analyst at my company. I need to know who the attending physician is and what the protocol is." The needle was in Mara's hand. "Step back," she said. "I'm sorry?" "Step back from the gurney. Now, please." He stepped back 1 foot, which was the minimum a man like that would consider compliance. His eyes went to the needle in her hand. "What are you doing?" She found the landmark, confirmed it, drove the needle in at the angle she needed. The hiss of escaping air was immediate. On the monitor above the gurney, the oxygen saturation began climbing. 83, 86, 91. The man in the suit watched this happen without speaking. "You need to wait in the hall," Mara said, not looking at him. She was already assessing the next step. The pressure was still low, internal bleeding likely, chest tube would need to follow. "There's a family liaison area near admissions. Someone will come to you." "I'm not family. I'm his employer, and I was present when this happened." He moved half a step closer to the gurney. "I need to know who's making decisions for his care." She looked at him then. Fully, directly, the kind of look that didn't soften anything. "Right now I am," she said. "And the best thing you can do for Raymond Foss in the next 10 minutes is not be in this room. So I'm asking you one more time, and then I'm asking security to help you." Something in her voice, not the words and not even the urgency, but the specific calibrated certainty underneath, made him take 2 full steps back. She turned back to her patient. His name, she pieced together from the paramedic's handoff notes, and a brief exchange with the intake coordinator, was Dayton Mercer, VP of Operations at a defense contracting firm called Arrowwood Systems, headquartered in Denver. He'd been traveling with Raymond Foss and had called 911 himself, which was the only thing in the situation that made straightforward sense. She didn't have time to think about what didn't make sense. She had a patient in hemorrhagic shock who needed a chest tube and a surgeon, in that order. She placed the chest tube in the time it usually took the residents to prep for one. Danny watched her hands with an expression she'd stopped noticing months ago. That particular mix of surprise and recalibration that happened when someone watched her work and updated whatever assumption they'd arrived with. Raymond Foss's pressure started coming up. By the time Dr. Weston arrived 19 minutes later, snow on his jacket, keys still in his hand, clearly pulled from sleep but functional, the patient was intubated, 2 large-bore IVs running wide open, the chest tube draining bloody fluid at the rate that said he'd been bleeding internally for at least an hour before the ambulance. Weston reviewed what she'd done in under 90 seconds, looking at the monitor readings, the tube placement, the fluid management. "X-ray?" he asked. "Ordered. Here." She handed him the tablet. He pulled up the image, looked at the chest tube positioning. His eyebrows went up slightly. "You placed this?" "Yes." He studied it another moment. Clean, accurate placement. No comment beyond that, but she didn't need one. He moved into physician mode and she transitioned to supporting, which was a line she crossed back and forth every shift without ceremony. Dayton Mercer, visible through the trauma bay glass, watched all of this from the hallway. Surgery was called at 12:31 a.m. Raymond Foss went up to the OR on a gurney that looked too still for a man who'd been breathing on his own 40 minutes earlier. Dr. Weston said he expected a long case. He'd update the family. There was no family present, only the employer in the expensive suit, when he could. Mara restocked the trauma bay, updated her documentation, and went back to the nurse's station. It was 12:38. The night shift ran until 7. She was 3 charts deep when Dayton Mercer appeared at the nurse's station without being announced. He'd been put in a liaison room down the hall. He'd left it. "Can I get an update?" he asked. Mara looked up. "Dr. Weston will contact you when the surgery is complete. That's the standard process." "I understand the standard process." He set both hands flat on the counter, a gesture that read as deliberate, a way of taking up space. "I'm asking if you have anything additional." "I don't." She held his gaze. "The surgeon has him now. That's where things stand." He didn't move immediately. He looked at her the way he had in the trauma bay, but differently. The earlier assessment had been dismissive, the automatic discounting of someone who didn't fit his expectation of competence. This version was different, more guarded, like a man rechecking math he'd already done and not loving the answer he kept arriving at. "What you did in there?" he said. "That was... I've seen trauma response before. You were fast." "So was his bleeding." Mercer almost smiled. "It didn't fully form." "Right." He straightened, took his hands off the counter. "The consultation room down the hall. Is that available for private use?" "Second door on the left. It's open." He nodded and walked that direction. She watched him for a moment, the set of his shoulders, the pace, then looked back at her charts. She spent the next hour doing her rounds. 7 patients on her care list tonight. An elderly man in room 114 recovering from hip replacement surgery, 2 post-op patients from afternoon procedures in 117 and 119, a woman in 121 with a COPD exacerbation who kept pulling at her oxygen mask, and 3 others in various states of monitoring and overnight recovery. She moved through all of them at the pace she always held, not rushing, not slow, consistent in the way that only becomes possible after enough repetitions that the work stops requiring conscious thought and starts running on something deeper. On her way back from room 121, she passed the consultation room. The door was not fully closed. She wasn't trying to listen. She was walking past at the pace she always walked, and Mercer's voice came through the gap the way sound travels through an imperfectly closed door. Not words at first, just tone, pressured, low. The voice of a man trying to stay controlled and not entirely managing it. She caught fragments as she passed. "Told you it was too early. Foss wasn't ready to be moved." She was past the door. "But if the package goes missing, that's on your people, not mine." Down the hall now, at the junction. She turned the corner and kept walking. She filed what she'd heard the same way she filed most things that didn't yet have context, without conclusion, without alarm, in a clean compartment she could return to when there was more to attach to it. That was a discipline, not a natural inclination. Her natural inclination, shaped over years in environments where incomplete information got people killed, was to treat fragments like warnings. But she'd also learned that acting on fragments without evidence was how you made bad decisions fast, so she filed it. She checked on her hip replacement patient in 114, confirmed his vitals were stable, and was adjusting his IV rate when she noticed the time. 2:14 a.m. She'd been on her feet for 6 hours and 40 minutes. Her lower back was the only part of her body that acknowledged this fact, and only mildly. She went to the break room, poured coffee that had been sitting in the carafe since the previous shift, and stood at the counter drinking it. She wasn't thinking about Mercer's phone call. She was thinking about her 121 patient's oxygen levels, which were holding but not comfortable, and whether she needed to call respiratory for a nighttime consult. Priya appeared in the break room door. 24 years old, first year out of nursing school, currently running East Wing coverage on the opposite side of the floor. She had the look of a new nurse in the early morning hours, not panicked, but close to the texture of it, hovering just above. "Do you ever get used to night shift?" she asked. Mara considered the question honestly. "You stop fighting it," she said. "That's not the same thing." Priya came in, poured her own terrible coffee, leaned against the counter. "That man, the one in the suit, from the trauma bay, he keeps walking past the nurse's station, like he's waiting for something." Mara looked at her. "How many times?" "3 that I saw. Maybe more." Priya shrugged, trying to make it casual, not quite landing it. He looks at everything. It's a little unsettling. If he approaches you, redirect him to the liaison room or call security. Don't engage." Priya nodded. "Has he said anything else to you? She hesitated. "After what he said in the trauma bay." "He apologized. Sort of." "Sort of?" Mara set down her coffee cup. "It's fine, Priya. Go check on 118. Her blood pressure was trending up on my last round." Priya went. Mara stood alone in the break room for another 30 seconds, which was all she allowed herself, and then she went back to work. At 3:15 a.m., the hospital went dark. Not a flicker, not a partial outage. The overhead lights, the hallway fixtures, the station monitors, everything cut simultaneously, and for 3 full seconds, Callaway Regional Medical Center was completely black before the emergency generators engaged and brought up the backup lighting. Red-edged, insufficient, casting everything in the flat, unflattering glow of systems built to sustain life functions rather than illuminate anything clearly. Every alarm in the building activated at once. Mara was already in motion before the generators kicked on. She had her flashlight in her hand. She carried one on every night shift, another habit she'd never explained to anyone. And she moved toward room 114 first, because the hip replacement patient had an IV pump that would alarm and a tendency toward disorientation that would not be helped by sudden darkness and noise. She got him settled, confirmed his pump had switched to battery backup and was running correctly, and was moving toward the second oxygen-dependent patient when she heard the glass. Not breaking, not shattering. The specific compressed sound of safety glass being struck with force, once, then silence, coming from the direction of the east stairwell. She stopped in the hallway and stood still for a moment, listening in a way that had nothing to do with her ears and everything to do with a particular kind of attention she'd spent years training and then spent more years trying to let go of, never quite managing it. Priya came out of room 118, looking pale in the emergency lighting. "Did you hear?" "I heard it." Mara's voice was quiet. "Go back in 118. Lock the door." "What? The power just—" "Priya!" She turned and looked at her directly, and something in her expression ended the conversation. "Lock the door, stay with your patient. Do not open it unless you hear my voice specifically. Go." Priya went. The east stairwell door at the end of the hall opened. 2 men came through it, dark clothing, moving at a pace that was not running but was not the pace of people responding to a power outage. Too low, too deliberate, too controlled. They were clearing the hallway with their eyes before they were fully through the door, and the taller one was keeping his right arm at a particular angle, close to his body, that Mara recognized with a clarity so instant it was almost physical. She turned, walked in the opposite direction with the speed and purpose of a nurse going somewhere specific, and turned into the supply room on her left. She didn't run. Running would have marked her. Inside the supply room, she moved to the back wall, pressed against it, and listened. The emergency lighting here was a single fixture above the door, enough to see shapes, not details. She did a fast inventory without touching anything. IV poles, supply carts with metal frames, a sharps container wall-mounted, a locked medication cabinet, shelving units running floor to ceiling, the secondary access door at the back, the utility corridor connection that most of the staff didn't know about, that she'd found during her second week because she learned building layouts the way other people learned commutes, by necessity. The footsteps in the hall were getting louder. 2 sets, moving methodically. Not searching wildly. Checking rooms in sequence, which meant they knew the layout, or enough of it. She assessed what she had. She assessed what they had. She assessed the geometry of the supply room, where the door would open and how, where the blind spot was. The handle moved. She controlled her breathing. Not suppression. Suppression creates tension in the shoulders that translates into sound. Control. Minimal, neutral, invisible. She'd learned the difference in a climate she could still feel when she thought about it, which she rarely did by choice. The door opened 6 inches and stopped. She heard one man say something to the other, too low to parse. Then the door closed. The footsteps moved on. She gave it 45 seconds, counting in her head without rushing, and then she went through the secondary access door into the utility corridor. The corridor ran the full length of the east wing behind the patient rooms, built for equipment transport, lit now only by the exit signs at each end, which gave enough red-edged light to navigate by if you were moving carefully. She moved carefully, one hand trailing the wall, counting access points. Room 116, room 114, her hip replacement patient alone. The mechanical room for East Wing HVAC, and then she stopped. Someone was inside the mechanical room. She stood without moving and received it the way her first team sergeant had taught her. Stop anticipating what you expect to hear and just listen to what's actually there. One person. Breathing unevenly, the breathing of someone in pain or fear or both. The sound of fabric shifting against metal, someone crouched against equipment and adjusting slightly because their body hurt. She stood with her hand on the door handle and made her decision in the space of one breath. Then she opened the door. The man inside had both hands up before she was fully through. He was pressed against the water heater housing in the dark, and the light from her flashlight caught him. Older, not large, wearing dress slacks and a button-down shirt torn at the collar. A gash above his left eye bleeding freely, dried tracks down his face. The look on his face, the specific compound look of someone who'd been running on adrenaline past its expiration and was now operating on will alone. "I'm a nurse," she said. He looked at her badge, at her scrubs. His shoulders dropped half an inch, which on a man braced like that was significant. "They're looking for me," he said. "I know." She pulled the door closed. "What's your name?" "Raymond." He swallowed. "Raymond Foss." She stopped. He was supposed to be in the OR. Dr. Weston had taken him up nearly an hour ago, sedated, chest open or close to it, nowhere near conscious. He should have been on the table under anesthetic with a surgeon's hands inside his chest cavity, doing the work that would keep him alive. "You were in surgery," she said. Not an accusation. A fact she was trying to attach to what she was seeing. "They moved me." His voice was fraying but controlled. The control of someone who understood that losing it entirely would cost him something he couldn't recover. "2 men. I thought they were orderlies. Transfer to a different wing," they said. "I was still coming off the sedative and I wasn't tracking right. Not until one of them took a call and told the other one to finish it." "How did you get away?" He exhaled slowly. "The sedative wasn't fully cleared. I don't think they anticipated that. Or they underestimated what a man does when he understands what finish it means." A pause. "I bit one. Slammed the other into a door frame. I shouldn't have been able to. I don't know how far away from here that happened." He was ashen, and his shirt was dark at the left side. The surgical site bleeding through. Standing shouldn't have been possible. The fact that he'd run from wherever they'd taken him, navigated to the utility corridor and made it into the mechanical room on a compromised surgical chest and a body still half sedated was the kind of thing that didn't have a clean explanation, except that people surprised you when the alternative was dying. "Your incision is open," she said. "Yes, I need to pack it. There are armed men 30 yards away." "I know." She was already opening the supply kit she'd pulled from the corridor cart. Automatic, preconscious, some part of her brain that had never fully come home from the army making the decision before the rest of her caught up. Gauze, tape, pressure bandage. "Lift your shirt," she said. He did. It was bad, but not unsurvivable if she moved now. The incision had partially separated. Not fully, the sutures holding at the edges but giving at the center. She packed it with gauze and applied direct pressure, working fast in the dark with her flashlight held between her teeth, angling the beam where she needed it. "The man who brought you in," she said, hand steady. "Dayton Mercer." Raymond Foss's face changed under the blood. "He's been in the hospital all night," she said. "He told them where I was." It wasn't horror. It was the specific flat devastation of a suspicion confirmed. "I thought he said he was taking me somewhere safe. We'd worked together for 6 years. 6 years." He pressed his lips together. "There's a drive. Portable data drive. It was in my bag when they brought me in." "What's on it?" He looked at her, the look of a man deciding in real time how much the situation required him to trust a stranger. "Everything," he said. "Procurement fraud, false defense contract certifications going back 9 years, falsified testing records, diverted funds, names, account numbers, transfer records. If that drive disappears..." The far end of the utility corridor opened, one set of footsteps, moving differently than the two she'd tracked before. Not methodical, not clearing rooms. Direct. The pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She killed her flashlight. In the dark, she put her mouth close to Raymond Foss's ear. "Behind the housing. Don't move. Don't make a sound, whatever happens." She felt him press back against the equipment. She straightened, positioned herself between the door and the water heater housing, and waited. The footsteps stopped outside the mechanical room door. A pause. 5 seconds. 10. And then a voice, low and unhurried, carrying the particular flat authority of someone who'd spent years being obeyed without raising his voice. "Raymond, if you're in there, this is easier if you come out now." Dayton Mercer. He wasn't in the liaison room. He wasn't in the hallway, or at the nurse's station, or anywhere on the map that made sense for a concerned employer, waiting for news about an injured colleague. He was here, in the utility corridor, in the dark, navigating without a light, which meant he'd mapped this corridor ahead of time, or had it mapped for him, which meant all of it had been planned. The suit and the panic in the trauma bay and the apology outside the nurse's station. All of it performance in service of something she was only now seeing the shape of. "Raymond," his voice again closer. He was at the door. "The drive doesn't save you. The people above me, they're not interested in negotiations, but I can still get you out of this. That's the truth." Silence. His hand found the door handle. Mara planted her weight, dropped her center of gravity 2 inches, and let 12 years of muscle memory come completely awake. The door swung open, and Mara moved. Not toward Mercer, toward the space beside him, the fraction of a second where a man stepping into a dark room is still adjusting, still waiting for his eyes to catch up to his intentions. She took his right arm at the wrist and elbow simultaneously, used his own forward momentum against him, and put him into the wall beside the door with enough force that the metal shelving on the other side rattled. It wasn't elegant. Her left shoulder took the edge of the door frame, and she'd feel it tomorrow. His head hit the wall harder than she'd intended, and he made a sound that was mostly surprise. She had his arm cranked behind him before he finished making it. "Phone," she said. "Left breast pocket. Take it out slowly with your free hand and set it on the floor." He was breathing hard, not panicking. She could feel the difference through the arm she was holding, the way his body was processing what had just happened and deciding how to respond. He was a man who was used to other people doing the physical work. He was recalculating. "You have no idea what you're..." She increased the pressure on the joint. Not enough to damage, enough to be unambiguous. "Phone," she said again. He reached slowly into his breast pocket and set the phone on the floor. She kicked it behind her toward the water heater housing, heard it slide across the concrete. "There are 4 men in this hospital," he said, his voice tight but controlled. "Armed. You cannot... This doesn't end the way you think it does." "How does it end?" "With you stepping aside. With Raymond coming with me. With nobody else getting hurt." "Raymond's in surgical recovery," she said. "He's not going anywhere." A pause. He was recalculating again. She could feel it. He's not in recovery, Mercer said. We both know that. She didn't confirm or deny it. Tell me about the 4 men. Entry points? I'm not going to... The pressure again. He exhaled sharply. 3 came in through the east stairwell, 1 through the service entrance on the north side. He was talking through gritted teeth, each word costing him something. They have the elevator banks covered. You're not moving him anywhere. Building security? Handled. Hospital staff? Contained in the west wing. They're not... He stopped. This isn't your fight. You're a nurse. You treated a patient. That's where your involvement ends. I'm going to need you to stop talking now, Mara said. She used the tubing from the supply cart. She'd grabbed a length of IV line along with the gauze, another pre-conscious decision she was grateful for, and bound his wrists to the pipe housing behind the water heater with a knot that would hold long enough to matter. She found a folded cloth in her scrubs pocket, a spare gauze pad, and wedged it in a position that would make loud vocalization difficult without actually obstructing his airway. She'd explain the distinction to someone later if she needed to. She picked up his phone. The screen had cracked when it hit the floor. It was still on. A call in progress, the timer running at 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Someone had been listening. She ended the call. Then she crouched beside Raymond Foss, who was still pressed against the water heater housing and hadn't made a sound through any of it. His color was poor in the flashlight beam. She put 2 fingers to his wrist, pulse rapid, thready, but present. Can you walk? She said. I walked here. That was 10 minutes ago. Can you walk now? He tested his legs. She could see the effort it cost him. Yes. We're going through the utility corridor to the north stairwell. There's 1 man at the service entrance on the north side. We're not using the service entrance. He looked at her in the way people looked at her when something she said or did recalibrated whatever they'd assumed about her. She'd been receiving that look her whole adult life, and she'd stopped finding it interesting a long time ago. Who are you? He asked. Mara Ellison. I'm your nurse. She helped him to his feet. Keep your hand on the wall if you need to. Tell me if you're going to pass out. I'll try. That's not reassuring. I know, he said. The utility corridor at 3 a.m., running on emergency generator lighting that amounted to a dim red stripe near the floor, was not a comfortable place to move a man with a compromised chest incision and residual sedative in his bloodstream. Mara kept pace with what Foss could manage, which was faster than it should have been and slower than she needed. She tracked the sounds of the building around her. The alarms had mostly cycled off now, which meant someone had silenced them, which told her something about how thoroughly Mercer's people had penetrated the overnight staff situation. She needed to know how many non-compromised staff were left mobile, where they were, and what access they had. What she had, 1 phone? Her own, with 4 bars of signal and a rapidly narrowing list of options. She dialed the hospital's main security desk. It rang 11 times and went to voicemail. She dialed the direct line for the overnight security supervisor, a man named Briggs, who she'd spoken to twice in 14 months and who had a reputation for being thorough. It rang 4 times and connected. Briggs? This is Mara Ellison, East Wing Night Charge. I know who you are. His voice was tight. We have a situation. I've got 3 of my staff unaccounted for and I can't reach... Listen to me carefully. She kept her voice low and even. There are at least 4 armed men in the building. 1 of them is at the north service entrance. 3 came through the east stairwell. They've been moving through the east wing. I have a patient who needs to be moved and I need a safe corridor. Silence. Then, who are these people? I'll explain everything later. Right now I need you to tell me which parts of this building you can confirm are clear. Briggs was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted. Then, chapel corridor on the 2nd floor. I have 2 of my people there and 3 nurses from the maternity ward who self-evacuated when the power cut. Nobody's come through that way. There's a utility stairwell off the chapel corridor that connects to the roof and to the parking structure. Roof access? Emergency egress only. Opens out, locks behind you. That was something. Not a solution, but a direction. I'm in the east utility corridor, she said. Level 1. What's between me and the chapel corridor stairwell? Main elevator bank, or avoid it. I've got eyes on 2 of them near there on the security feed that's still working. Service hall past radiology. Radiology's dark, but I think it's clear. He paused. Think. Good enough. I'll check it. She ended the call and looked at Foss, who was leaning against the corridor wall with his eyes open and his jaw set. He'd heard most of it. Radiology, he said. Through radiology to the second-floor stairwell, then the chapel corridor. Then what? Then I figure out the next part. He almost laughed. It came out wrong, too much pain in it, but the impulse was there. You don't have a plan. I have a direction. That's better than I had 3 minutes ago. They moved. Radiology at 3 a.m. during a power outage was the particular kind of dark that felt physically heavy. No windows, no ambient light from hallways, the equipment standing in shapes that made no sense until your eyes adjusted. Mara moved through it slowly with her flashlight angled low, watching for anything that wasn't supposed to be there. The room was clear. The corridor past radiology was not. She saw the figure at the far end before he saw her. He was positioned with his back partially to her, watching the junction where the service hall met the main corridor. Standard coverage angle. She studied him for 5 seconds from the shadow at the radiology door, and in those 5 seconds she read his posture, his equipment, his positioning, and the way he was distributing his weight. He was former military, not currently active. The small things were off, the way they always went off after a few years of private sector work. But the training was there. She also clocked something else. He was watching the main corridor and not the radiology hallway, which meant his assignment was to cover the junction, not this approach. He wasn't expecting anyone to come from behind him because whoever had planned this hadn't accounted for the utility corridor. Mercer hadn't known about it either. She filed that. She looked at Foss, held up one finger, pointed forward, made a gesture she hadn't used in years but came back to her hands without effort. Wait. Stay low. He understood. He pressed himself against the wall and didn't move. She moved along the right side of the corridor, with her body close to the wall, keeping to the edge of the floor where the boards were less likely to flex. The figure at the end was 20 yards away, then 15. She could hear him breathing now, the faint sound of someone alert but not alarmed, covering his assigned position and expecting nothing to come from this angle. She was 8 feet away when his posture changed, not dramatically. A small shift. The shoulders, the angle of the head. The instinctive awareness that something in the peripheral environment had changed without anything concrete triggering it yet. She moved the last 8 feet in 2 seconds. What followed was not clean. Clean was a word for training scenarios, and this was a corridor in a darkened hospital with a man who was combat trained and physically larger than her, and had the advantage of body armor. She could see the outline of under his jacket. She hit him in the specific way that bypassed the armor, targeting joints, targeting the throat with controlled precision, targeting the back of the knee. He went down hard, but not without resistance. His elbow caught her across the cheekbone, and she felt the sharp, bright pain of it and moved through it because the alternative was stopping. He was down, and she was controlling his airway in the way that produced unconsciousness without lasting damage in under 20 seconds. She sat back on her heels and her hands were shaking slightly, which she noted clinically and without concern. That was adrenaline, not weakness. The distinction mattered. She pulled his radio, killed the volume, pocketed it. His sidearm she looked at for 2 full seconds and then left. She had made a deliberate decision 14 months ago when she came to Callaway Regional and hung up the last version of herself, that she was done carrying weapons. She revisited that decision in the space of 2 seconds and arrived at the same answer she'd arrived at then. Not because she couldn't use it, because of what using it would mean about the distance she'd traveled since the last time she had. She went back for Foss. He had pressed himself flat against the wall the way she'd indicated and had not moved. He was gray and sweat-sheened and looked like a man running on a biological credit he'd already overdrawn, but he was upright. That man's going to need a doctor, he said, looking past her. He's breathing. How did you get her, stairs, she said. Bob. The chapel corridor on the second floor was exactly what Briggs had described. A short hall connecting the hospital's non-denominational chapel to the East Wing administrative offices, populated right now by 2 of Briggs's security staff, 3 maternity nurses who'd evacuated in a cluster and were keeping very quiet, and a maintenance worker named Gerald, who had been on the second floor when the power cut and had not moved since. Mara came through the stairwell door with Foss's arm over her shoulder, and everyone in the corridor moved or made noise simultaneously. "He needs to sit down," she said, which was the most pressing sentence. Two of the maternity nurses, older women, experienced, the kind who didn't rattle, moved immediately to help her get him to the wall. She kept pressure on the incision site with one hand while they worked, and she spoke in the low continuous murmur she used when she needed people to stay calm. Not instructions exactly, just presence. Just the sound of someone who knew what was happening. One of Briggs's men, a younger guy, 20s, name tag reading Walsh, came to her right shoulder. "Security supervisor is on 2 with us," he said. "He's been trying to reach the sheriff's department. Lines are jammed." "Cell?" "Working but slow. He's got a call in. They know there's a situation. They don't know the full picture." "Get me Briggs." Walsh brought her to a man she recognized from a brief encounter near the security desk her second week, mid-50s, solid, the look of someone who'd spent enough years in security to develop a particular kind of patience for the unexpected. He was on his phone, and when he saw her, he ended the call. "Mara Ellison," he said, like he was confirming something he'd been told. "Briggs," she assessed him quickly. "How much have you got from the security feeds?" "East Wing is mostly dark. 3 of my cameras are out. I've got partial coverage on the main corridor in the north side." He turned his phone toward her. On the screen, a grainy feed showing 2 figures at the main elevator bank, and another feed showing the north service entrance with 1 figure stationary near the door. "That's 3, she said. "There should be 4. "I know." His jaw was tight. "I've been looking. The 4th man. Not on any feed she could see, which meant he was either in a camera-blind area or had moved to a position that hadn't been anticipated. Neither option was comfortable. Foss, seated against the wall with one of the maternity nurses monitoring his pulse, said, "The 4th one isn't security." Everyone looked at him. His face was exhausted and pale and completely lucid. The setup. 3 men for perimeter containment, 1 man for the target. That's the structure. The 4th man's role isn't to cover exits. His job is to find me specifically. "Someone with my description," Mara said. "Someone who knows what you look like and who knows this building's layout." He looked at her. "Someone who's been here long enough to learn it." She ran back through the night, the trauma bay, the hallway conversations, the consultation room with the door ajar. Mercer walking past the nurse's station 3 times, which Priya had mentioned, which she'd processed as impatience, and which she now processed differently, not pacing, mapping. "He had someone else with him," she said. "He always does," Foss said. "Victor Cade, his head of operational security, former intelligence, the kind that doesn't appear on any public record. If Mercer's here, Cade's here." He exhaled slowly. "Cade is the 4th man, and he is significantly more dangerous than the other 3. The radio she'd pulled from the man in the corridor crackled. She turned the volume up slightly and held it to her ear. Static, then a voice, clipped, flat, the specific affectlessness of someone trained to transmit information without tone. "East 2 clear, north holding, elevator holding, package status unknown. Mercer is non-responsive." A pause. Then a different voice, quieter. The kind of quiet that wasn't calm, but rather the absence of unnecessary noise. "Find the nurse." She lowered the radio. "Find the nurse. Not find Foss. Not find the package." The priority had shifted in the time since she'd left Mercer in the mechanical room, which meant Cade had enough information to understand that Foss wasn't the only problem anymore. She looked at Walsh. "The roof egress? It opens to the parking structure sky bridge. From the sky bridge, you can get to the parking structure stairwells." He hesitated. "But the sky bridge is exposed. No cover. If anyone's watching the exterior, what's the alternative?" "Stay here and wait for the sheriff." "How long?" He checked his phone. "Briggs says 15 minutes, maybe less." 15 minutes was an eternity if Cade had already started moving through the 2nd floor. It was also the rational choice if the sky bridge was a shooting gallery. She ran the geometry in her head, the positions she knew, the positions she didn't know, the variables she couldn't account for. She was still running it when the chapel door at the end of the corridor opened. She knew before she saw him. The way he moved through the door, controlled, economical, the specific absence of wasted motion that marked someone trained by people who'd spent significant money ensuring that training lasted. He was not large, which surprised people who expected physical threat to look one particular way. Medium height, lean, dark clothing, no visible weapon, though she'd have bet significantly that this was not because he wasn't carrying one. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. The corridor was 30 feet long. Between them, 7 people who could not move fast enough. He looked at her with the expression of a man encountering something that required reassessment, which was the expression she'd been receiving from people her entire adult life. But this version was different. This version was the reassessment of a professional. "Ellison," he said, just the name. No escalation in it, no demand, just identification. "Cade," she said. He was still. She was still. The 7 people between them had gone very quiet in the way people go quiet when the air pressure in a room changes. "Walk away from Foss," he said. "That's the offer. It expires in about 10 seconds. What happens at 10 seconds? This gets harder for everyone. She looked at him, really looked. The way she looked at things when she was making a decision she'd have to commit to completely. He was reading her the same way. 2 people running the same calculation from opposite sides. "You're not going to discharge a weapon in a corridor with 7 civilians," she said. "You're right." Something moved in his face, not quite acknowledgement, not quite respect. "But I don't need to." He moved, she moved. The difference was that she was already closer to Walsh than Cade had accounted for. And Walsh had the radio in his hand, and she'd already clocked that Cade's approach angle left his left side briefly exposed as he cleared the first group of nurses. She was not trying to stop him. She was trying to redirect him. Buy enough time and enough noise. She hit Walsh's arm deliberately, and the radio went across the floor, making more noise than anything else in the corridor, and she said, loudly, clearly, in the voice she'd used to direct combat unit response to mass casualty events at 3 different FOBs over 7 years, "Everyone into the chapel. Move now. Briggs, the chapel. Now." People moved. That was the thing about a voice like that, shaped right and delivered without hesitation. People moved before they decided to. Cade reached her when she was the last one at the chapel door, and she took the impact against the doorframe rather than in the open corridor because that was the better geometry. And for the next 45 seconds, the 2 of them were in close quarters contact that was technically not a fight, so much as a sustained negotiation conducted through physics. She was good. She knew she was good. He was better in 2 specific ways that she identified and worked around, and in 3 other ways that she didn't have answers for yet. He got her to the floor on the second exchange. She took him with her. They ended up with her at a disadvantage in position, but not in leverage. She had his right arm in a configuration that made any downward pressure by him directly problematic for both of them simultaneously, which was the best outcome available in the situation. A standoff conducted horizontally on the floor of a hospital corridor at 3:30 in the morning. He was breathing hard. So was she. "You've done this before," he said. Not accusatory, more like a man closing a file he'd left open. "So have you." "Different circumstances, I'd guess." "Probably." Her cheekbone where the other man's elbow had connected was throbbing with dedicated persistence. Her left shoulder from the doorframe earlier had joined it. She was going to be a spectacular collection of bruises in approximately 6 hours. From inside the chapel, she could hear Briggs on his phone, his voice urgent and flat and getting through to someone who mattered. From outside the building, very faintly, came the sound she'd been waiting for without letting herself wait for it. The oscillating wail of sirens, multiple, getting louder. Cade heard it too. She felt it in the arm she was holding. A small, almost imperceptible shift. Not defeat. Recalculation. 15 minutes, she said. That's what they told me. Turns out it was less. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who are you?" She'd been asked that twice tonight, in the mechanical room by a bleeding man who needed an answer, and now on the floor of a hospital corridor by a man who was asking something different. She didn't answer either version of the question. The sirens were close now. Very close. She could hear tires on the parking structure ramp outside, the specific pitch of radio chatter bleeding through walls at volume. Through the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor, she heard boots. Multiple sets, moving fast, and then a voice that was not one of Cade's people and not hospital security, but carried the precise command tone of someone who'd spent years coordinating rapid response an environment significantly more demanding than this one. The stairwell door came open hard. The first figure through it was in tactical gear, dark jacket, radio headset, the quick and structured movement of law enforcement with a specific objective. Behind him, two more, and then, moving past all of them, not rushing but walking at the deliberate pace of someone who had already established exactly where they needed to be. A figure in a different kind of authority, not a uniform. A dark jacket over civilian clothes, silver at the temples, carrying in his posture the specific weight of someone for whom a hospital corridor in the middle of a crisis was not a disruption to their normal operating environment. He walked to the center of the corridor and looked down at Mara on the floor. She looked back up at him. He was not a face she expected to see in Decker Falls, Montana, at 3:30 in the morning, in any set of circumstances. He was a face she'd last seen 3 years ago, across a table in a building in Virginia that she was no longer supposed to know existed. Deputy Director Warren Solis of the Defense Intelligence Agency looked at her with the measured expression of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by her and had never quite gotten comfortable with it either. "Ellison," he said. Her jaw tightened. "We need to talk," he said. Behind her, she heard Cade go very, very still. "We need to talk," Solis said, and Mara thought, "Of course you do." She released Cade's arm and got to her feet without help, which took more effort than she wanted anyone to see. Her left shoulder was doing something unpleasant that she'd have to inventory later. The cheekbone was swelling. She could feel it in the way her vision was slightly narrower on that side, the particular pressure of tissue filling space it didn't have. Two of the tactical team moved in on Cade before he was fully upright. He didn't resist. He had the look of a man running a longer calculation than the immediate situation required, which told her something about what he knew and how far this went. Solis was already moving toward the chapel door, expecting her to follow. She looked back at Raymond Foss, still on the floor against the wall with a maternity nurse's hand on his wrist, checking his pulse. His color was worse than it had been 20 minutes ago. She crouched beside him. "He needs to go back into surgery," she said to the nurse. "Incision's been compromised. He's been ambulatory for, she checked her watch. Close to 40 minutes. Get a gurney up here and call Weston out of the OR. Weston's still... Pull him. This is more urgent." She looked at Foss. "You're going back up." "The drive," he said. "I know. My bag. Admissions intake would have logged it. If Mercer's people got to intake..." "I'll find it." She stood. "Stay with her. Don't try to get up again." He nodded. He looked like a man who'd used up most of what he had, and knew it. She went through the chapel door after Solis. Though the chapel was small and dark, and smelled of old wood and recycled air. Solis had positioned himself near the window at the far end, which gave him a sightline to the parking structure exterior and the tactical vehicles now visible in the amber wash of the lot lights. He turned when she entered. She looked at him in the way she used to look at him, measuring the gap between what he was presenting and what he was actually doing, which had always been wider than it appeared. "How long have you been tracking Arrowwood?" she said. No preamble. He'd never expected it from her, and had stopped performing surprise at its absence a long time ago. 14 months, he said. The same length of time she'd been at Callaway Regional. She noted this without saying it. "Foss was yours?" "Foss was ours," Solis said. "Source development, 18 months. We built the case from the outside. He was building it from the inside. The understanding was that when he was ready to move, we'd be positioned to receive him." He paused. Tonight was not the arrangement. "Who moved the timeline?" "That's what I'm trying to determine." He clasped his hands behind his back. An old habit, a tell she'd cataloged years ago for situations exactly like this one, when he was working through something he hadn't fully resolved. Mercer wasn't supposed to be in Montana. Foss was supposed to surface in Denver on Thursday with the drive and a handler present. Something changed in the last 48 hours that we don't have full visibility on yet. Mercer found out. Apparently. And instead of running, he decided to clean it up personally, which suggests the exposure goes higher than Mercer, Solis said. High enough that someone above him decided containment was worth the operational risk. She thought about the voice on the radio. Find the nurse. The priority shift that meant she'd been identified not as collateral, but as a problem to be managed. Who's above Mercer? She said. Solis looked at her with the expression she'd always disliked most from him. Not evasion exactly, more the careful rationing of information by a man who'd spent so many years deciding what other people needed to know that he'd lost the instinct for just telling the truth. That's part of what Foss's drive contains, he said. You don't know, or you're not saying. Both, to different degrees. He moved to the window again. Outside, she could see the tactical team fanning across the parking structure, the efficient geometry of a coordinated sweep. We have a name, Victor Hale, Senior Acquisitions Director at the Defense Procurement Office. We've had the name for 4 months, and we have circumstantial connections, but nothing prosecutable. He turned back to her. Foss's drive closes that gap, if it still exists. It exists, she said. Find the intake bag that came in with Raymond Foss at 11:47. Admissions logged it. If Mercer's people haven't gotten to the storage room, it's still there. Solis took out his phone and made a call in 3 words. A name, a location, a directive, that she recognized as the particular economy of someone who had people in motion and didn't need to explain himself to any of them. She watched him hang up and said, "You knew I was here." Not a question. He didn't treat it as one. Yes. 14 months. Yes. You placed me here. A pause that lasted 1 second longer than it should have. We were aware of your placement here. The distinction was the kind that mattered. She ran it through and arrived at the part that explained several things she'd filed in the back of her mind over 14 months without connecting. The position opening that had come through channels she hadn't questioned because she'd been tired and ready to stop moving. The relocation package that had been smoother than those things usually were. The fact that Callaway Regional's East Wing had better emergency equipment than a hospital this size in a city this size would typically justify. You used me as a contingency, she said. We assessed that if anything went wrong with the Foss extraction, having someone with your background in the facility improved the probability of a recoverable outcome. He said it with the particular tone of a man who had rehearsed the framing. That assessment proved correct. She was quiet for a moment. The chapel air sat between them. I left, she said. I made a decision to leave. You don't get to make that decision reversible without telling me. You're right. He said it simply, without qualification. That was the thing about Solis that had always made him difficult to simply dislike. He was capable of directness when he decided the situation required it. I'm telling you now. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It isn't. Outside, someone on the tactical radio reported the east stairwell clear, then the north service entrance. The 3 perimeter men from Cade's team were being walked out in flex cuffs, which she could see through the window as silhouettes in the parking structure lights. One of them was limping, the man from the radiology corridor, she assumed. She felt a brief clinical interest in whether she'd damaged the knee or just disrupted the joint, which she set aside. Mercer, she said, East Wing mechanical room based on your report. Team's moving there now. He's secured to the pipe housing. He made a call before I got the phone. Someone was listening for at least 4 minutes. Whatever was said on that call, we'll pull the records. Solis's phone vibrated and he looked at it. Something shifted in his face. Not alarm, but attention moving to a higher priority. The drive has been located. Intake storage, still sealed. She exhaled. One thing. Foss needs surgery, she said. He's been mobile with a compromised chest incision for close to an hour. He's going to crash if we don't get him back into the OR in the next 20 minutes. Your team is working on it? Callaway's team. Yes. She paused. He needs to survive long enough to testify. Make sure whoever is standing outside his OR door knows that's the priority. Solis looked at her. I'll have 2 agents on his room for the duration. Good. She moved toward the chapel door. Ellison. She stopped. We're going to need a full debrief. Tonight's events, everything you observed from the time Mercer entered the facility. It'll take several hours. She looked back at him. I'm on shift until 7. He blinked, just once. You want to finish your shift? I have 7 patients, 6 now with Foss going back up. She held his gaze. I'll give you the debrief when my shift is over. You can send someone to the nurse's station. She left without waiting for his answer. The East Wing at 4 a.m. looked like the aftermath of something, which it was. Emergency lighting still active. 2 of the patient room doors open from when Cade's men had cleared through them. Equipment displaced. The supply room door still ajar from when she'd gone through it. A federal agent she didn't recognize was standing at the junction of the main corridor and the east hallway with his hands in his pockets, watching the tactical team work. He looked at her scrubs as she passed. She kept walking. Priya was still in room 112, exactly where Mara had put her. When the door opened, she came to her feet with the expression of someone who had spent 90 minutes alone in a room with an unconscious patient and a locked door and had not unlocked it despite whatever sounds she'd heard outside. "Is it?" Priya started. "It's over. The police are here." Mara moved to the patient. Room 112 was a post-op appendectomy. A 40-year-old man named Douglas, who was still sleeping through everything with the profound indifference of good anesthesia wearing off slowly. Vitals stable. IV intact. She documented. Priya stood in the middle of the room watching her. "How are you?" "Your face." "I know. You should have someone look at it." "I will. Later." She finished the note, moved to the door. "Help me check on the others. 114 first. "Mara." Priya's voice stopped her. "What happened out there?" She considered the question honestly and decided the honest answer was too long for right now. "I'll tell you later," she said. "All of it. I promise. Right now I need to know my patients are stable." Priya nodded. She looked shaken. She was shaken, appropriately so, but she followed. They moved through the East Wing together, room to room, the familiar rhythm of rounds restored over the wreckage of the last 90 minutes. Room 114. Hip replacement patient awake, confused by the noise and the lighting, needing reassurance and a medication check. Room 117, sleeping. Room 119, sleeping. Room 121. The COPD patient had pulled her oxygen mask off again, which under these circumstances felt almost comforting in its consistency. Mara reseated the mask and sat with her for a minute, holding her hand, talking in the low murmur until the woman stopped pulling at the tubing. She was doing this, the hand-holding, the murmuring, when her mind surfaced something she'd filed and not yet fully examined. Mercer's phone call in the mechanical room corridor. If the package goes missing, that's on your people. She'd filed it. She'd filed the earlier fragment from the consultation room too. Foss wasn't ready to be moved. And then something Foss had said in the mechanical room, which she'd been moving too fast to fully process in the moment. "I thought he was taking me somewhere safe." We'd worked together for 6 years. 6 years at Arrowwood Systems. A senior analyst building an evidence file for 18 months while employed by the organization he was documenting. The level of access that required, the discipline that required, the sustained performance of normalcy in a place where the people above him were engaged in 9 years of documented procurement fraud. She thought about that kind of endurance, the specific weight of carrying something for that long without anyone knowing. Then she thought about solace. 14 months. The awareness of her placement here, the calculation she represented. She was still thinking about it when her radio, her hospital radio, which she'd set to the nurses' station channel, crackled. "East Wing charge, this is OR desk. Dr. Weston is out of the first case and has been briefed on the Foss readmission. He's requesting you personally assist on the secondary procedure. Says you'll understand the anatomy better than anyone." A pause. His words. She stood up from room 121's bedside chair. "Tell him I'm on my way up," she said. The OR at 4:30 a.m. had the specific quality of a room that had already run hard and was being asked to run again. The first surgical team was in various states of breakdown. Instrument count, documentation, the quiet organized deconstruction of a completed case. Weston was at the scrub sink when Mara pushed through, already gowning. He looked at her face. "You need imaging on that cheekbone." "After," she said. "Mara, what's his status?" Weston exhaled. The exhale of a man who had learned to pick his battles. The incision dehisced about 40% of the center length. He's got a hemothorax developing on the right side, probably from the activity. His pressure is marginal. He turned off the water with his elbow. He's alive because he's stubborn, and because you packed that incision well enough to keep the bleeding slow. "What do you need from me?" "I need you across the table being a second set of hands that knows what it's looking at." He moved toward the OR door. "The resident I have tonight is good, but she hasn't seen a chest this complicated. I need someone who won't freeze if this gets worse before it gets better." She followed him in. The OR was cold and bright in the way ORs always were, the particular flat certainty of the lighting that left nothing soft. Raymond Foss was on the table under full anesthesia, draped and prepped, his chest already exposed to the shoulder. An anesthesiologist she recognized, a quiet man named Prakash, who she'd worked with twice before, gave her a nod from behind his machine. The resident, a woman in her late 20s named Dr. Adeyeze Obi, looked at Mara across the table with the specific expression of someone being handed more than they expected. "You're the nurse from the East Wing?" Obi said. "Yes." "The one who—" She seemed to be editing as she went. "The one who placed the chest tube earlier?" "Yes." Obi looked at her for 1 second with the particular expression Mara had stopped cataloging because she'd seen it too many times to find it interesting. Except tonight it landed differently, because tonight she was too tired and too bruised to maintain the distance she usually kept between herself and other people's surprise at her competence. "Let's go," Weston said. They went. The surgery took 2 hours and 14 minutes and was not straightforward. The hemothorax was larger than the imaging had suggested, and there was a secondary bleed from a vessel that had been under stress since the original injury and had finally given way under the demands Foss had put on his body in the last hour and a half. Weston was good. She'd known he was good from her first month here, and Obi found her footing once the initial pressure passed. Mara worked the space she was given with the quietness she always brought to it, anticipating by half a step, moving without being directed. At one point, Weston said, without looking up from the field, "How many of these have you been in?" "Enough," she said. He didn't ask again. At 6:48 a.m., Raymond Foss was moved to the ICU, breathing on his own, pressure stable, with 2 federal agents outside his door and a third inside it, which was one more than Solis had promised, and which she approved of. She stripped off her gloves in the hallway outside the OR and stood for a moment with her back against the wall, just standing. Her shoulder had progressed from unpleasant to a sustained conversation she was going to have to pay attention to soon. The cheekbone had settled into a deep throb that was going to make eating uncomfortable for several days. Dr. Obi came out of the OR behind her. She stood beside Mara for a moment without speaking, which Mara appreciated. Then she said, "I've been in surgery for 3 years. I've never seen anyone do what you did tonight, in that corridor, in the OR." She paused. "What you did with that chest tube in the trauma bay, I reviewed the x-ray. The placement was perfect." "It was good enough," Mara said. "There's a difference." Obi considered this. "Why are you a nurse?" It wasn't a diminishment. The way she asked it was genuine. The question of someone trying to reconcile 2 things that didn't fit together the way she'd been taught they should. Mara looked at the ceiling for a moment. The honest answer was complicated enough that she usually didn't give it. But she was 7 hours into a shift that had tried to kill her patient twice, and she was too tired to manage the distance. "Because people end up in hospitals on the worst days of their lives," she said, "and doctors save them. But nurses stay with them." She pushed off the wall. "I wanted to stay." Obi was quiet for a moment. "That's—" She didn't finish the sentence. Mara walked toward the elevator. The debrief started at 7:20 a.m. in the hospital administrator's conference room, which had been commandeered by the federal team and now contained 4 agents. 2 men from Solis's office who had arrived on a flight from Denver at some point in the last 3 hours, a sheriff's department investigator, and a woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office who had driven from Billings and had the look of someone who'd made that drive before and didn't enjoy it. Solis sat at the end of the table. Mara sat across from him in her scrubs with a hospital ice pack on her cheekbone and told them everything in the order it happened, clearly and without editorializing, the way she'd been trained to debrief and had never fully stopped doing even after she'd left the organization that trained her. She described what she'd seen, what she'd heard, what she'd done, and why. She answered questions without hedging. When she didn't know something, she said so. It took 2 hours and 15 minutes. At the end, the woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office looked up from her notes. "The drive? The contents have been confirmed?" "Forensics has it," one of Solis's men said. "Preliminary review confirms procurement falsification, contract fraud, and what looks like a parallel funding structure that diverted approximately $240 million over 9 years." He paused. There are also communications in a protected folder that implicate direct authorization from the Defense Procurement Office for at least 3 of the contract certifications. The woman's pen stopped moving. That's Hale's office. Yes. A silence settled over the table that had a particular quality, the quality of people absorbing the size of something. What's the current status of Victor Hale? The sheriff's investigator asked. Hale is in Washington, Solis said. He was notified this morning that Arrowwood's operations are under federal investigation. He has not been charged yet. His attorney has already made contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He's going to run, Mara said. Every head at the table turned toward her. She looked at Solis. You know he's going to run. Mercer's in custody. Cade's in custody. 4 of his contracted men are in custody. Foss is alive. If Hale is the authorization point for the fraudulent certifications, then the moment he understood Foss survived this morning, his calculation changed. She set the ice pack on the table. He has money moved into positions that don't require paperwork to access. He has contacts in places that aren't in the treaty network. You have a window, and it is closing. Bamba-musasan. Solis looked at her for a moment with the expression she recognized, the one that said he agreed with her and was annoyed about it. He picked up his phone. The call he made was short. 3 sentences. She caught enough to know it was going to someone in Washington with arrest authority, which was all that mattered. The U.S. Attorney's woman was looking at Mara with the expression Mara had received all night from people who had made an assumption about her and then found themselves in the process of revising it. Miss Ellison, she said, who are you exactly? The question again, the 3rd time tonight. Or this morning. She'd stopped being able to tell the difference. She reached for the ice pack. I'm the night charge nurse on the East Wing, she said. I need to write my shift handover notes. She stood. Solis said her name as she reached the door. She turned. He was holding a folder she hadn't seen him produce. Cream-colored, the kind of folder that didn't come from a hospital conference room. He set it on the table and slid it 3 inches in her direction, not far enough that she had to come back, close enough that she could see the seal on the cover. Department of Defense, her name on the tab. She recognized the folder. She'd last seen it, or one identical to it, 3 years ago in a building in Virginia, on a table in a room where she'd made a decision that she'd understood was permanent. This arrived 2 weeks ago, Solis said, before last night, before any of this. I was looking for an appropriate time. What is it? A review finding, he said, regarding the classified report you submitted in 2021, the one that was suppressed. He paused. The review was initiated 6 months ago by the Inspector General's office, independent of our operation. They found the suppression was improper. The report has been restored to the official record. The room was very quiet. She looked at the folder from across the room. She didn't move toward it. My record, she said. Corrected. As of 2 weeks ago. He met her eyes. You were right, Mara. The report, the assessment, the recommendation, all of it. They know that now, officially. She stood at the door for a moment. The exhaustion of the night sat on her like a physical weight, and underneath it was something older and heavier that she'd been carrying for 3 years and had learned to carry so completely that she'd stopped feeling its actual weight. You stopped feeling it when it became part of you. You only felt it when someone tried to take it away. Who suppressed it originally? She asked. Her voice was level. Solis's expression shifted, just slightly. The authorization for suppression came from the Defense Procurement Office, he said. She heard what he wasn't saying. She ran it to its conclusion and arrived at a place that made the night's events click into a pattern that was larger and older than Arrowwood Systems or Raymond Foss or a data drive in an intake storage room. Hale, she said. We believe so. Yes. The man who had killed her career was the same man who had funded the operation that had tried to kill her patient tonight. The man whose name was on the authorization for Foss's assassination attempt was the same man who had looked at her report 3 years ago and decided she was a problem to be managed. She had been, in a way she hadn't known, in his crosshairs for 3 years. The folder sat on the table. She crossed the room and picked it up. She didn't open it. She held it and felt its weight, which was not the weight of paper, but of something being returned to her that she'd been told was gone permanently. Her phone buzzed in her scrubs pocket. She looked at it. An unknown number. A Montana area code, but not one she recognized. The message was 2 lines. Foss won't be alive to testify. You made the wrong enemy. Consider what happens next very carefully. She looked at the message for 3 seconds. Then she turned her phone and held it so Solis could read the screen. His expression changed entirely. He reached for his own phone as he stood. Across the table, the U.S. Attorney's woman was already moving. "That number," Solis said. "Get me a trace on that." "It's a burner," Mara said. "I know it's a burner. I need to know where it pinged." She looked at the message again. Consider what happens next very carefully. The phrasing of someone who believed the threat was sufficient, who believed she would receive it and recalibrate, who had her number, a number that was not publicly listed and not connected to any professional record under her current name, which meant someone had run her background deeply enough to find what wasn't supposed to be findable, which meant someone still inside the system had helped. She looked up at Solis. "You have a leak," she said. He was already on his phone. His jaw was set in a way that told her he'd considered this possibility before tonight and was now considering it with new urgency. The door opened. One of the tactical agents from the hallway leaned in, and his expression carried the specific quality of someone delivering information they would have preferred not to be delivering. "Deputy Director." His voice was careful. "We just got word from Washington. Victor Hale left his residence 40 minutes ago. He was scheduled for a deposition this morning, and his attorney called to postpone. His car is at Dulles. Gate? That's the problem." The agent paused. "No gate. He didn't go through the terminal. His vehicle was found in the long-term structure. No boarding record. No ticket purchase in his name. TSA has nothing." Solis stood completely still. Mara looked at the phone in her hand, at the message, at the timestamp, 7:44 a.m., Mountain Time. Dulles was in the Eastern Time Zone, which made it 9:44 a.m. there. Hale had been at the airport when he sent this. He already knew the trace would find nothing. He'd sent it anyway, which meant it wasn't a threat designed to stop her. It was something else. It was a message to tell her he was already gone. He was already gone. Mara stood in the commandeered conference room with that fact settling into the room the way cold air settles. Not dramatically, just filling every available space until the temperature changed. Solis was on his phone before she finished processing it, moving toward the window with the focused urgency of a man who had contingencies for his contingencies and was now running through them in order. The U.S. Attorney's woman, her name was Delaney, Mara had caught it during the debrief, was on her own phone, her voice low and clipped, words like fugitive status and international alert finding their way through the controlled quiet of her delivery. The sheriff's investigator looked at his notepad, then at the door, then at his notepad again, with the expression of a man who had come to Callaway Regional expecting a contained local situation and had ended up inside something with a radius he couldn't see the edge of. Mara looked at the message on her phone one more time. Consider what happens next very carefully. She put the phone in her pocket. The folder with the DoD seal was in her other hand. She set it on the conference table, smoothed the cover once with her palm, and left it there. Not because she didn't want it, because she needed both hands and a clear head, and the weight of what that folder meant was not something she had the bandwidth to carry right now without it affecting her thinking. She could feel it there when she walked out of the room. She could feel it all the way down the hall. The East Wing at 7:50 a.m. was in transition, day shift arriving, night shift handing off. The particular overlap of two different rhythms of people who'd had entirely different nights. The day-charge nurse was a steady woman named Harriet, who had been at Callaway for 19 years and responded to the federal agents in her corridor with the measured equanimity of someone who had seen enough strange things to stop ranking them. Mara found her at the nurse's station. "I need to brief you on all 7 patients," Mara said. Harriet looked at her face, at the cheekbone, at the careful way Mara was holding her left shoulder. "I heard some of what happened," Harriet said. "I'll give you the medical version now and the full version later." She pulled up the chart system. 114 is stable, disoriented from the night's disruption, needs reassurance on rounds. 117 and 119 are both fine. 121 pulled her mask again at approximately 3 a.m. I reseated it. She's been compliant since, but watch her. The other 3, Mara. Harriet put her hand on the counter between them. "Go get your face looked at. I've done handovers before." "I know you have. Let me finish." Harriet removed her hand and let her finish. It took 12 minutes. She was thorough because thorough was the only version of this she knew how to do. When she was done, Harriet was writing notes in her own system and nodding with the focused attention of someone who would do exactly what needed doing without requiring further supervision. Priya appeared at the end of the station. She'd clearly been waiting. She had her bag on her shoulder and her coat half on, end-of-shift posture. But she hadn't left. "Are you actually okay?" Priya said. The question was direct enough that it deserved a direct answer. "Not entirely, but I'm upright." "What you did last night," Priya started, and then stopped, and Mara could see her trying to find words for something she didn't have a frame for yet. "Go home," Mara said. "Sleep. It'll make more sense after you sleep." "Will it?" "Probably not," she admitted, "but you'll be less tired when it doesn't make sense." Priya left. Mara stood at the nurse's station for a moment, alone in the particular way she was often alone even when people were around. Not isolated, just operating from a place that others weren't entirely sharing. Then she went to the urgent care clinic on the ground floor and had someone look at her face. The cheekbone was not fractured, which the urgent care physician, a young man named Dr. Ferris, who clearly knew about the events of the night and was working hard not to ask about them, confirmed with imaging that took 20 minutes and a careful palpation that made her vision white at the edges for about 3 seconds. The shoulder was a grade 1A/C joint sprain. He gave her an ice pack, a sling she immediately took off because the sling interfered with everything, and a look that communicated professional concern without crossing into personal territory. "You should rest," he said. "I know," she said, and meant it in the way that meant she wasn't going to. She was back in the corridor outside the ICU by 9 a.m., where Solis found her 20 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee from the cafeteria, one of which he handed her without asking if she wanted it. She took it. "Hale used a private charter," Solis said, "not filed under his name. The aircraft departed Dulles at 7:12 a.m. Eastern, before the alert was fully distributed." He drank his coffee. "We have a destination." "Where?" "Reykjavik, originally filed. Actual destination, based on the flight path deviation flagged by FAA, is more likely Tbilisi." "Georgia. Not a treaty country for extradition in several relevant categories." "He has infrastructure there," Mara said. "We believe so. A consulting firm that Arrowwood used as a pass-through entity. We've been building a picture of it for 4 months." He paused. "There's a mechanism. It takes time, and it takes the right pressure applied to the right places, but there is a mechanism." "How much time?" "Weeks. Possibly less if the Georgian government decides cooperation serves their interests, which depends on factors I'm actively working." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "The drive helps. 240 million in provable fraud. Documented falsification of defense certifications. That's not a case a prosecutor declines. Hale has no leverage to offer that's worth more than what we have on him." Mara thought about the message on her phone. "Consider what happens next very carefully. Sent from an airport departure lounge by a man who'd had enough preparation time to map her unlisted number, which meant he'd had help, and the help was operational before last night, before Foss even arrived at Callaway Regional." "The leak," she said, "working on it." His voice was careful in the way that meant he'd already identified a direction he wasn't ready to share. "The number trace came back to a prepaid device purchased in Bethesda, Maryland, 8 days ago. We have purchase location footage. We're running it." 8 days ago is before Foss was shot? Yes. So Hale had known 8 days before the attempt that he might need a direct line to Mara Ellison specifically, which meant someone had told him about her placement at Callaway Regional well before last night. Not a reactive leak, a structural one. Someone inside Solis's operation who had been feeding information long enough to be embedded. "You have a short list," she said. "I have a list," he said. "Not as short as I'd like." She drank the coffee. It was bad. Hospital cafeteria at a full boil, and then sitting, the kind of coffee that was hot and caffeinated and delivered what it promised without being enjoyable about it. She drank it anyway. "Mercer," she said. "What's he saying?" "Not much. His attorney arrived at 6 this morning, which tells you how prepared they were for this scenario. He's been advised to cooperate and has not done so yet." Solis set his cup down on the window ledge beside him. "Cade is more interesting." "Cade is talking? Cade is negotiating, which is different." He folded his hands. He wants prosecution consideration in exchange for operational details on Hale's network. He's representing that he has information on the pass-through entities, the domestic contacts, and the identity of the internal source. She looked at him. And you believe him? I believe he has something. Whether it's everything he's claiming is a different question. He paused. He also asked about you. She waited. He wanted to know if you were military, past tense. I told him that was not information I was in a position to share. Solis's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, something drier. He said, "Tell her I understand the difference now." She thought about the floor of the chapel corridor. The 45 seconds during which two people who had been trained by different organizations for broadly similar purposes had conducted a conversation through physics and arrived at a standstill. I understand the difference now, the difference between a nurse and what she was before she was a nurse. He'd gone in not knowing. He'd come out knowing. She didn't find it gratifying in the way she was perhaps supposed to. She found it tiring, which was honest. Let him negotiate, she said. If he has the internal source, that's worth more than what you'll get from his prosecution. Solis nodded slowly. That's my assessment as well. By noon, the hospital had resumed something close to normal operations, which was its own kind of accomplishment given what the building had been doing 10 hours earlier. The federal presence was still visible. 2 agents on the ICU floor, one at the main entrance running IDs on anyone requesting access to specific patient areas. But the tactical teams had cleared out and the East Wing's emergency lighting had been restored to standard, and the supply room door had been quietly rehung by a maintenance worker who hadn't asked any questions. Mara was not supposed to still be in the building. She was aware of this, and had decided it didn't apply to her today. She was at the ICU nurses station reviewing Foss's post-operative chart, not because his care team required her input, but because she needed to see the numbers with her own eyes. When one of the federal agents, a woman named Torres who had introduced herself during the debrief, appeared at her elbow. The U.S. attorney needs a formal statement, separate from the debrief, evidentiary quality, on record. When? Now would be the preference. She's in the administrator's conference room. Mara set the chart down. 20 minutes. Torres looked like she was going to push back, then read something in Mara's expression that redirected her. 20 minutes, she agreed. Mara went to the ICU room where Raymond Foss lay connected to monitors and an IV and a ventilator that was doing a portion of his breathing for him, post-surgical and sedated, in the flat and vulnerable stillness of a body that had been through more than most bodies were asked to absorb in a single night. The 2 agents outside his door checked her badge and let her through. She stood at his bedside and looked at his chart data on the wall monitor. Pressure stable, oxygenation good, heart rate regular. The numbers of a man who was going to survive, which wasn't guaranteed when she'd found him in the mechanical room with his hands up and his incision bleeding through his shirt. She didn't stay long. He didn't know she was there, and she hadn't come for his awareness of it. She'd come because she needed to see the numbers, and she'd seen them. She went to give her statement. The formal statement took 90 minutes and was conducted by Delaney with 2 recording devices running and a second attorney present who Mara understood to be there to ensure procedural integrity, which was fine. She told it the same way she'd told it in the debrief, linearly, factually, without editorializing. And when Delaney asked her to characterize the level of tactical coordination she'd observed from Cade's team, she gave an assessment that was specific enough that both attorneys stopped writing and just listened. Delaney said at the end, "Ms. Ellison, your background, prior to your nursing career, is classified in several relevant respects," Mara said. "You can make that request through the appropriate DoD channels. Deputy Director Solis can facilitate." Delaney nodded. She'd expected this, clearly. She capped her pen with the deliberateness of someone closing a chapter they'd known they couldn't fully open today. "We'll be in touch about grand jury proceedings. The case will take several months to build formally, though the evidence from the drive significantly accelerates the timeline." "I understand. Your testimony will be central." Delaney met her eyes. "I want you to know that what you did last night, securing the patient, securing the drive, containing the situation, that's the reason we have a prosecutable case. Without the drive, we have Mercer in custody and not much else. Without Foss alive, we have evidence and no witness. Mara considered this. Foss built that evidence over 18 months, she said. Credit accordingly. She left the conference room and stood in the corridor outside it, and the building was quiet around her in the midday way that hospitals were quiet. Not actually quiet, always active, but the activity running at its default frequency rather than the frequency of crisis. Her phone buzzed. Not the unknown number this time. Solis. She answered. Cade's attorney has accepted the terms of the cooperation agreement, he said. We're getting everything. The pass-through entities, the domestic network, the procurement contacts. A pause. And the source? Who? A senior analyst in our interagency coordination office. Been there 11 years. Name is Garrett Pruitt. His voice was even, but she could hear the specific flatness that came over him when he was angry and containing it. He had access to the Arrowwood operation files from the Joint Task Force clearance he held. He's been feeding to Hale for approximately 22 months. 22 months. 4 months longer than the Foss source development had been running. Hale had known about the investigation before it was 3 months old. He's in custody? She said. As of 40 minutes ago. Another pause. He also had access to the personnel relocation files from my office, which explains how Hale had your number. There it was. The complete circuit. Pruitt had pulled her file, passed it to Hale, and Hale had spent however many months knowing she was in Decker Falls, knowing what she'd done before she was in Decker Falls, knowing she was the contingency Solis had positioned in the facility where his primary evidence source was going to attempt to surface. And he'd sent the message anyway, from the departure lounge, not because he thought it would stop her, but because he was the kind of man who needed the last word, even when the last word was hollow. Hale doesn't know about Pruitt yet, she said. Correct? So he thinks he still has an inside line. Correct. Solis's voice carried something she didn't often hear from him, a specific controlled satisfaction. Which means when his attorney reaches out to negotiate, and he will, he'll be doing it under the impression that his leverage includes information we don't have. He paused. He'll negotiate from a position of strength that doesn't exist anymore. She thought about that, about a man in Tbilisi, or wherever the plane had actually landed, who had made a career out of knowing more than the people across from him, who had suppressed her report and dismantled her career and orchestrated an assassination attempt on a federal witness and sent a threatening text from an airport lounge because he believed, comprehensively, that he was always the one controlling the terms, who did not yet know that the analyst he'd been buying for 22 months was sitting in a federal holding facility explaining the architecture of his entire network in exchange for a reduced charge. When his attorney makes contact, she said, don't correct his assumptions. That is precisely my intention, Solis said. She hung up and walked toward the hospital's main exit, and the afternoon light was coming through the glass doors in the flat gray way of Montana November, which was not beautiful, but was clear. She slept for 4 hours. Not well. The shoulder made comfortable positioning and negotiation, and her mind kept running variables that didn't require running anymore. But 4 hours was what she had, and she took it. She woke at 5 p.m. to 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, a text from Solis that said, "Call me when you're up," and a voicemail from the hospital's chief nursing officer requesting a meeting at her earliest convenience, which was the kind of language that could mean several different things, and Mara didn't have the energy to decide which one right now. She called Solis first. Hale's attorney made contact at 2 p.m., he said. They're representing that their client has information on an active intelligence compromise within our interagency task force and is willing to offer it in exchange for immunity and non-extradition. He's offering Pruitt. Yes. Who, as of this morning, is cooperating fully and has already given us everything Hale is trying to sell. Solis paused. The U.S. Attorney's Office responded that they were unable to offer immunity terms at this time and that extradition proceedings through the appropriate treaty mechanisms were being initiated. How did the attorney respond? He asked for 48 hours to consult with his client. Another pause. The Georgian Ministry of Justice has been in contact. They are, as I expected, interested in demonstrating cooperative posture with U.S. federal law enforcement, because the alternative is harboring a man with $240 million in documented federal fraud attached to his name. That is the arithmetic they appear to have done, yes. She could hear papers moving on his end. Hale's position is deteriorating faster than he knows. By the time his attorney conveys the U.S. Attorney's response, and he understands that the Pruitt offer is worthless, the Georgian authorities will have been briefed and his options narrow to approximately one, which is to return voluntarily and negotiate from there. He won't return voluntarily. No, he won't. Solis's voice was matter of fact. So we wait for Georgian cooperation and begin the extradition mechanism. It is slow. It is frustrating. It will work. She sat on the edge of her bed with the phone to her ear and the afternoon light going gray outside her window. The hearing, she said, when Foss testifies. Mercer, too, if he eventually cooperates. That's going to be public. Grand jury proceedings are sealed, but the trial will not be. She'd known this. She was running it now in a different way. Not worrying about it, cataloging it. The trial that would be public. Her name that would attach to it. The version of her that existed on paper at Callaway Regional Medical Center, and the version that would emerge through testimony and cross-examination and whatever the defense attorneys did with her classified background when they got hold of it. The things she'd built here for 14 months. The quiet. The routine. The rooms at 3 a.m. The woman in scrubs who stayed with people on their worst days. That version of herself was going to survive the trial, or it wasn't, and she couldn't control which. The DOD folder, she said. The review finding. Still in the conference room, Solis said. I had it secured. You can collect it whenever. I'll get it tomorrow. She ended the call and sat in the quiet of her apartment for a while. She was back at Callaway Regional at 6:45 p.m. Not because she was scheduled, but because she had 7 patients, and the night shift charge was a man named DeLeon who was capable but new to the East Wing, and she wanted to brief him in person rather than rely on Harriet's handover notes alone. DeLeon was grateful and not surprised to see her, which told her something about what the day shift had said about her, which she didn't examine closely. She briefed him on all 7 patients in 12 minutes, was satisfied that he had what he needed, and was heading back toward the elevator when she stopped. She turned and walked to the ICU instead. Foss had been moved off the ventilator at 4 p.m. He was sedated, but a lighter sedation now, the post-surgical kind that was management rather than necessity. The monitor showed stable numbers. He looked like a man who had survived something, which was what he was. She sat in the chair beside his bed and wrote her notes for the formal statement follow-up Delaney had requested. She wrote them in the specific way she'd been trained to write operational notes, factual, chronological, precise, about what was observed versus inferred. It took 40 minutes. The room was quiet except for the monitors and the occasional sound of the agent's shifting position in the hallway. She was capping her pen when Foss's eyes opened, not fully. The partial opening of someone surfacing through sedative layers, finding the light, and finding it manageable. His gaze moved across the ceiling, then to the window, then to her. She waited to see if he was actually conscious or running on something shallower. His mouth moved. She leaned slightly forward. You stayed, he said, barely audible. I had notes to write. A long pause. His eyes were working to focus. The drive. Federal custody. They've reviewed the contents. She kept her voice low and even. It's enough, Raymond. What you built is enough. He was quiet for a moment. His hand on the blanket moved slightly, the small, restless movement of someone in pain that wasn't quite pain, more the body's complaint about everything it had been through. Hale, he said. They're working on it. She paused. He's going to face it. It's going to take time, but he's going to face it. His eyes closed, then opened again. How long did you know? About what you... He seemed to be having trouble finding the shape of the question. What I was before this? She considered the answer. I knew who you were from the time you told me your name in the mechanical room. I didn't know what it connected to until later. Not what I meant. His voice was thready but coherent. I meant, how long have you been doing this? Being this. She understood the question. Being the person who was both things simultaneously. The woman who placed chest tubes and rewrote nursing notes and sat with patients through the dark hours, and the woman who had cleared a corridor and read a tactical situation in the time it took most people to register there was a situation. 14 months here, she said. The other part, longer. And it doesn't... He stopped. Breathed carefully, the way people breathe when the mechanics of it require attention. It doesn't make the other part feel smaller, doing this? She thought about that honestly, about room 121 and the oxygen mask and the woman's hand in hers, about Dr. Obi's question in the hallway outside the OR, about the chest tube and the needle and the specific satisfaction of watching an oxygen sat climb on a monitor because she'd done something right at the right moment. No, she said, it's the same thing, just a different instrument. Boss's eyes closed again, this time the closing of someone going under rather than coming up. His breathing settled into the regular rhythm of real sleep. She sat in the chair for another minute, then gathered her notes and stood. She was at the door when her phone buzzed. Not Solis, not Torres or Delaney, or any number she recognized from the last 24 hours. An international number. A country code she had to think about for a moment before she placed it. Georgia. She stared at it for 3 seconds, then she answered. The voice on the other end was unhurried, male. The specific controlled quality of someone choosing each word with an awareness that the call was likely being recorded. Ms. Ellison. A pause. We haven't spoken before, but I understand you know my name. She kept her voice completely neutral. Hale, I want you to understand something, Victor Hale said. Everything that happened at that hospital, Mercer, Cade, the men he brought in, that was not my preference. That was a decision made under pressure by someone who panicked. Mercer panicked. Mercer made an operational decision I did not authorize. His voice was smooth, and she could hear the effort behind the smoothness, the machine that ran underneath it. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking you to consider that there are multiple actors in this and they don't all carry the same culpability. Mr. Hale, I know about your report, he said, the 2021 assessment. I know it was suppressed. I know you've now seen the review finding. A pause. I want you to know that the suppression decision was not mine alone. There were 4 signatures on that authorization. Mine was one of them. Another pause, timed. The other 3 are still in their positions. She stood very still in the hallway outside the ICU. Names, she said. That's a conversation for a different forum, he said. I'm willing to have that conversation, with the right guarantees. You're negotiating. I'm communicating. His voice stayed level. I think you understand the difference between a man who runs and a man who is trying to find a way through. I haven't done anything in the last 18 hours that suggests I intend to escalate. You sent a threatening message from Dulles. A brief silence. He stopped. That was a mistaken judgment. I won't pretend otherwise. She thought about the 3 other signatures. 3 people still in their positions. 3 people who had looked at her assessment, which had been correct, which the review had confirmed was correct, and decided that burying it served their interests more than publishing it did. 3 people who were still operating, still making decisions, still sitting in whatever rooms people like that sat in. Why me? She said. You could have called Solis. You could have had your attorney reach out to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I called you, Hale said, because you're the only person in this situation who has a reason beyond professional obligation to want those 3 names. She didn't say anything. I'll be in touch, he said, and the line went dead. She stood in the ICU hallway with her phone in her hand and the call log showing a 4-minute and 12-second duration from a Georgian number that Solis's team would already be running, and she felt the specific quality of a situation that had seemed to be resolving, revealing itself to be something larger and older, and with more unseen weight than she'd understood when she was in the mechanical room with a man who needed his incision packed. She pressed Solis's number. He picked up on the second ring. He called me, she said. A pause. Then, with a careful precision, when? 40 seconds ago. Georgian number. He says there were 4 signatures on the suppression authorization. He's offering the other 3 names. Silence on the line. The particular silence of a man revising a picture he thought he'd already fully drawn. He's not done running, Solis said slowly. He's repositioning. He thinks he can trade his way out. Maybe he can, she said. Those 3 names, I know what they mean. She looked at the closed door of Foss's room, at the agents outside it, at the hallway of the ICU, which was quiet and lit and doing what hospitals did, which was keeping people alive through the night. Get a trace on that number and get Delaney on the phone. Mara. Solis's voice was different now, not the operational tone, something underneath it. If those names are real, if there are 3 more people at that level, then we find them, she said, the same way we found the rest of it. She hung up. Down the hall, the elevator doors opened. A gurney came through, 2 nurses moving fast, a doctor already talking into her radio. Someone's emergency arriving at the moment when emergencies arrived, which was always and without schedule. Mara watched the team move toward the bay with the assessment she could not turn off. Airway, color, pressure, what they had, and what they needed. And then she put her phone in her pocket and walked toward them. Not because anyone had asked her to, because there was work to do. The gurney went past her, and she fell in beside it without being asked. The patient was a woman, late 60s, cardiac presentation. She could read it in the color and the way the paramedic was narrating and the specific quality of distress on the woman's face, which was the particular frightened dignity of someone who had never expected to need this much help and was trying to maintain some version of herself through the process of needing it. Mara took her hand while the team transferred her to the bay bed, just held it, said her name back to her when she gave it, Barbara, and kept talking in the low, continuous register that was not about the words but about the presence, the signal that someone was there and paying attention and was not going anywhere. The attending got what she needed from the team. Barbara's vitals stabilized within 20 minutes. It wasn't Mara's case, and she stepped back when the East Wing attending arrived and took over, because that was how it worked and how it should work. She walked out of the bay at 7:40 p.m. and stood in the corridor, and her hands were steady and her shoulder was a sustained argument, and she was, despite everything, exactly where she was supposed to be. She went home at 8 and slept without dreaming for the first time in recent memory. So, the weeks that followed were not clean. Nothing about the process of dismantling a 9-year criminal architecture was clean. It was slow and procedurally dense and involved more conference rooms and recorded statements and legal filings than any single narrative could hold without losing its shape. Mara gave testimony 4 more times in the first month. She gave it the same way every time. Factual, sequential, precise, about the line between what she observed and what she inferred. The attorneys on both sides tried in different ways to make that line move. It didn't move. Mercer broke in the 3rd week, not dramatically. It happened the way these things usually happen, which was quietly, in a conference room, with his attorney present and a cooperation agreement already drafted and sitting on the table between them. The leverage that had kept him silent, the belief that Hale still had operational capacity, that the network was still functional enough to make cooperation dangerous, collapsed when his attorney showed him the Georgian extradition filing and the scope of Cade's cooperation agreement and the preliminary indictment list, which had 23 names on it, and several of them were people Mercer had believed were untouchable. He signed the agreement on a Tuesday afternoon. His statement added 17 pages to the prosecutorial record and confirmed, among other things, that Dayton Mercer had known about the assassination plan against Raymond Foss 48 hours before Foss arrived at Callaway Regional Medical Center. He had driven Foss to the hospital, not to help him, but to deliver him to a location where Cade's team had already established access. The performance in the trauma bay, the suit, the dismissal, the demands for a real doctor, had been exactly that. Performance. A way of establishing his presence as a concerned employer while the actual operation unfolded in the building around him. When Mara read this in the summary Delaney sent her, she sat with it for a few minutes. She thought about the moment in the trauma bay when she'd turned and looked at Mercer directly and told him that his friend needed her more than his opinion. She thought about the specific contempt in his voice, "Get me someone qualified," and the way she'd filed it and moved on because there was a patient in front of her and the patient was what mattered. He'd been performing, but the contempt had been real. Those two things weren't contradictions. They were the same thing wearing different clothes. The contempt was what made the performance easy. It was always easier to dismiss someone you genuinely didn't regard. She filed this understanding in the same place she filed most hard things. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with clarity. It had happened. She knew what it was now. That was enough. Victor Hale was extradited from Georgia on a Thursday morning, 41 days after he'd left Dulles. The Georgian Ministry of Justice had moved faster than anyone had predicted, which Solis attributed to a combination of the evidence weight and a diplomatic conversation at a level he declined to specify. Hale landed at Dulles at 6 a.m. Eastern under federal escort and was processed and arraigned by 2 p.m. His attorney entered a not guilty plea, which was procedurally expected and substantively irrelevant given what was in the evidence record. The arraignment was public. Mara watched the footage on her phone in the Callaway Regional break room during a shift, sitting at the table with her coffee. The footage was a news broadcast pool feed, 30 seconds of Victor Hale walking from a vehicle into a federal courthouse in a suit that was less perfect than the one she'd imagined him wearing. His face arranged into the careful blankness of a man who had decided that projection of composure was the only remaining asset he had. He looked like someone who had spent 41 days understanding that the room he was walking into was not one he could control. She watched it once, put her phone in her pocket, and went back to her patients. The 3 names came out in the 5th week. Hale had offered them through his attorney in the 2nd week, framing it as a cooperation gesture, and the U.S. Attorney's Office had taken the information and investigated it and then charged all 3 of them independently without offering the immunity terms his attorney had requested on the grounds that the evidence gathered through Cade's cooperation and Foss's drive was sufficient to proceed without a deal. Hale's attorney objected. Delaney's office pointed to the evidence record and did not adjust their position. The 3 names, a deputy assistant secretary at the Pentagon, a senior contracting officer at the Defense Logistics Agency, and a retired general who had moved into a consulting role that now made considerably more sense, appeared in the public indictment on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, they were in every major news outlet with the specific quality of a story that had been building underground for years and finally broke the surface with enough force to move everything around it. Mara read about it on her phone before her shift. She thought about her report. The 2021 assessment that had gone into a classified file and been stamped and buried by 4 sets of hands, one of which had now been extradited and 3 of which had just been indicted. She thought about the version of herself that had written that report, younger, less worn down, still operating under the assumption that if you documented something correctly and submitted it through the correct channels, the system would process it the way it was designed to process things. She'd been wrong about the system. She'd been right about everything in the report. Those 2 things had coexisted for 3 years. She'd carried both of them, and the second one, being right, had not made the first one easier. Right didn't pay rent. Right didn't restore the career pathway that had been quietly closed in front of her. Right, by itself, in a system where the wrong people controlled the filing mechanism, was almost entirely useless. What changed things was documentation, Foss's 18 months of work, Cade's negotiated disclosure, the drive in the intake bag that her hands had ensured stayed in the building, the chain of custody that ran from a man bleeding in a mechanical room to a federal courthouse in Washington. The system hadn't fixed itself. People had fixed it. Slowly, imperfectly, at significant personal cost and not without failure along the way. She thought this was worth understanding, not as comfort wasn't really the point, but as a functional truth about how change actually moved, which was not in the direction you pointed, but in the direction of accumulated pressure from multiple sources over time. And what mattered was being one of those sources and continuing to be one even when the pressure felt like it was disappearing into nothing. Her shift started at 7. She put her phone in her pocket and went in. Raymond Foss was discharged from Callaway Regional on a Tuesday, 33 days after he'd arrived on a gurney through the trauma bay doors. He walked out. That was the first thing. He walked with a cane and a moderate lean that Dr. Weston expected would resolve over the following months, but upright and moving under his own power. The agents who had been stationed outside his room for 33 days flanked him to the exit, and there was a vehicle waiting that would take him to a location Mara hadn't been told and didn't need to know. He stopped at the nurses' station on his way through the East Wing. Mara was there because she'd known he was being discharged today and had arranged to be at the station at that time without making it look arranged, which was the kind of small management of appearances she engaged in without much thought. He looked different from the man in the mechanical room. Better, obviously. 33 days of surgical recovery and medical care made most people look better than they did immediately post-trauma, but also different in a way that wasn't just physical, less compressed, like something he'd been carrying at a particular angle had been set down, and his posture had recalibrated around its absence. "I didn't thank you," he said. "You were sedated for most of the time when thanks would have been appropriate," she said. He almost smiled. The almost smile of a man who had been through something that made full smiling feel like it required more than he currently had access to. They told me what you did. The whole of it. Solis talks too much. He told me about your report, Foss said. The suppression. Hale. He paused. I didn't know, when I started documenting the Arrowwood fraud, that there was a previous case. A previous person who'd already seen it and tried to do something about it. She looked at him. Would it have changed anything? He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. No, I don't think so. Another pause. But I'm glad you were here. So am I, she said, and meant it in a way that surprised her slightly. The specific surprise of discovering that something you'd said reflexively was also true. He offered his hand. She shook it. His grip was still weak from the surgery, which she noted clinically and which made her feel something that wasn't clinical exactly. Something closer to what it felt like when a patient you'd worried about crossed a threshold you'd been waiting for them to cross. Take care of yourself, she said. I will, he said. You too. He walked toward the exit with his cane and his agents, and she watched him go and then turned back to the charts on her screen. Because there were 7 people on her care list today, and they needed her attention in the particular way that patients always needed attention, which was regardless of whatever else was happening. The formal military review finding arrived in a physical envelope, which she hadn't expected. She'd assumed it would be digital, another PDF, another file to be processed and stored. But it came in a cream-colored envelope with a DoD return address, postmarked Washington, D.C., delivered to Callaway Regional's administrative office, and forwarded to her mailbox with a note from the admin coordinator that said simply, "This looks official. Hope it's good news." She opened it at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning with coffee that she'd made herself, and that was considerably better than the hospital cafeteria version. The finding was 4 pages. The language was bureaucratic and dense, and had the quality of documents produced by committees, layered, qualified, hedged at the edges. But the conclusion was unambiguous. The 2021 classified assessment submitted by then-Major Mara Ellison had been reviewed by the Inspector General's office and found to be accurate, appropriately documented, and improperly suppressed. The suppression authorization had been rescinded and marked as procedurally invalid. The assessment had been restored to the official record with its original submission date. Major Ellison's service record had been corrected to reflect the restored filing and the removal of the administrative notation that had been attached to her separation. 3 years and 4 pages. She read it twice, not because she needed to read it twice, but because the first time she was reading it, she was still waiting for the part that qualified the conclusion. And the second time she was reading it, she was doing something closer to just receiving it. The report had been right. The system had eventually confirmed it. The gap between those two facts was 3 years and a career and a relocation to a mid-sized city in Montana and 14 months of night shifts in whatever the last 5 weeks had been. She couldn't make that gap smaller by looking at the finding. The gap was the gap. It would always be the gap. But the finding was also real. The correction to her record was real. And in the specific, unromantic way that documented truth mattered, not because it changed the past, but because it existed in the present and could not be unwritten. It was enough. She set the pages down, drank her coffee, and looked out the window at the November street. Montana in late autumn was not beautiful in the way that places were beautiful in travel photographs. It was beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when they were simply what they were, gray and clear and cold, the kind of clarity that came from the absence of anything softening the light. She'd moved here because the position had been available and she'd been ready to stop moving. She'd stayed because she was only now naming this to herself with any precision. She'd been needed here in a way that didn't require her to perform a version of herself. The night shifts and the difficult patients and the small, unremarked competencies of the work had let her be useful without requiring that anyone understand exactly what kind of useful she was. The problem with that arrangement was also its value. The invisibility that had let her rebuild had also, for 14 months, let her believe that being unseen was the same as being safe from the particular cost of being seen. It wasn't. She knew that now, if she hadn't known it fully before. Being unseen was just a different kind of exposure, the exposure of being a resource that couldn't advocate for itself. She thought about Dayton Mercer in the trauma bay, the contempt in his voice, The performance of dismissal that turned out to be both deliberate and genuine simultaneously. She thought about every version of that dynamic she'd encountered over her career. In the Army, in the units she'd served in the hospitals she'd moved through. The specific pattern of being assessed by the surface of her and found insufficient, and the work that existed underneath that assessment that the surface-level assessors never fully reached. She'd spent a long time being angry about that pattern. Then she'd spent time being tired of being angry about it. Then she'd arrived somewhere else. Not acceptance, exactly. More a kind of practical recognition that the pattern existed and would continue to exist regardless of her emotional relationship to it. And the question was not how to make other people see her correctly, but how to keep doing the work that needed doing while they were busy not seeing. The work that needed doing was the thing that mattered. The recognition was secondary. The recognition was also, as it turned out, not entirely avoidable. Solis in the chapel corridor, Dr. Obi outside the OR, Foss at the nurses' station. But it came as a consequence of the work, not as a goal of it. That was the distinction she'd been living for 14 months without fully articulating it. And she was articulating it now over bad coffee on a Sunday morning in Montana, and it felt less like a revelation than like naming something she'd already known for a long time. She finished the coffee, washed the cup, and went for a run. Tit. Solis called in December, on a weekday afternoon when she was between shifts. He didn't call often. She'd learned that when he called, it was because something required a decision or a disclosure, not because he was managing a relationship. The Hale prosecution is moving to trial, he said. March. Current projection. Mercer's cooperation has accelerated the timeline. The 3 additional defendants are on a separate track that will likely run concurrent. Boss is ready to testify? He will be. He's been working with the prosecution team. A pause. Your testimony will be scheduled separately. They want to sequence it after Foss's. Your background will come up in cross-examination. The defense will request the classified records. The DoD has agreed to a limited declassification that covers your service history, your rank at separation, and the nature of your operational role, without disclosing specific mission details or your unit's operational history. She thought about her service history in a courtroom, her rank, her operational role. The woman in scrubs having it established on the record, in a public proceeding, that she had been a special operations major and a trained combat medic, and in a category that would require careful phrasing in a civilian legal context, someone who had neutralized armed personnel in a hospital corridor in Decker Falls, Montana. All right, she said. There may be press attention, Solis said, given the scope of the case. I know. The hospital administration has been briefed. He seemed to be selecting a word. Supportive. She almost laughed. Supportive was doing significant work in that sentence. How supportive? The chief nursing officer would like to meet with you at your convenience. I understand she's reached out several times. She has. She'd been scheduling around it without fully acknowledging that she was scheduling around it. I'll call her. Mara. His voice shifted slightly, not the operational tone. What you did in that building, I want to be clear that I understand what it cost and that the deployment, the way we placed you, the choice we made to do it without full disclosure. Warren. She used his first name, which she rarely did. I know. A pause. That's not an absolution. No, she agreed. It isn't, but it's done, and Foss is alive, and the drive was secured, and 23 people are facing federal charges, and my report is back on the record where it should have been 3 years ago. She paused. I'm not collecting absolutions right now. I'm working nights. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the dry precision of a man who had known her long enough to understand when she was serious, and when she was also a little bit serious, of course you are. Keep me updated on the trial schedule. She hung up and went back to the East Wing. The meeting with the chief nursing officer, Dr. Pauline Osei, happened on a Wednesday in the last week of November, in an office that looked exactly like hospital administrative offices, functional furniture, framed certificates, a dying plant in the corner that no one had given up on entirely. Osei was in her early 60s, silver locks, the particular steadiness of a woman who had run a nursing department for 16 years and had long since sorted people into the category of people who were capable and the category of people who were not, and had stopped spending significant energy on the second category. She looked at Mara across the desk with an expression that was direct and not unkind. "I've been briefed," she said, "by hospital administration, by the federal contacts. I've read the incident reports and the witness statements from your colleagues." She paused. "I've also been given access to your service record, with your consent." "I know," Mara said. Solis had asked. She'd agreed. "What you did in this hospital on the night of November 8th was extraordinary," Osei said. "I want to be precise about what I mean by that. Not extraordinary because of the tactical elements, though that is its own considerable thing. Extraordinary because while those events were unfolding, you continued to provide care. You prepped the trauma bay before the ambulance arrived. You placed a chest tube that the attending described as textbook. You went into an OR at 4:30 in the morning and stood across from the surgeon and did what needed doing." She set her hands flat on the desk. "That's not a person doing two separate jobs. That's a person who has one job and does it in every circumstance available." Mara looked at her. She didn't say anything because the statement didn't require a response, and offering one would have deflected from it, and she was done deflecting from things that were simply true. "I want to talk about your role here going forward," Osei said. "Not as a correction of something inadequate, because your work has been excellent, but because," she paused, choosing carefully, "because there's a version of what you can offer this hospital and this department that you have not been given the space to offer. And I'd like to change that." She outlined it. A lead clinical educator role, working across nursing teams on emergency response protocols, trauma response, de-escalation procedures. The position had been in development for 2 years and hadn't been filled because they hadn't found the right person. It wasn't a promotion away from patient care. It was a structure that kept her in patient care while also building the capacity of the people around her. She'd still have her East Wing patients. She'd also have the broader reach she'd been, Osei said directly, underutilized on for 14 months. Mara listened to all of it. Then she said, "I want to keep my night shifts." Osei blinked. Then, the small exhale of a woman recalibrating. "We can structure it around your preferred schedule." "Then yes," Mara said. Osei nodded. She didn't perform surprise, which Mara appreciated. "One more thing," she said. "The new residents who rotate through this hospital, there's a cultural problem we've had for years with how nursing staff are perceived and utilized, particularly in high acuity situations. I'd like you to be part of changing that." "How?" "By being visible," Osei said simply. "By doing what you do and letting people see it." Mara thought about 14 months of operating in a space where not being seen had felt like protection. About the woman in scrubs who could be overlooked, underestimated, passed through, which had been both a conscious choice and a form of self-protection she'd needed at the time, and had maybe needed for too long. "I can do that," she said. The trial began in March and ran for 6 weeks, which was shorter than the prosecution had projected and longer than felt survivable from the inside. Mara testified on the 4th week in a courtroom in Denver that was full in the way courtrooms in high-profile federal cases were full. Press, observers, the particular charged atmosphere of a proceeding that everyone in the room understood to be significant. She sat in the witness stand and answered questions with the same quality she'd brought to every statement, every debrief, every conversation with every attorney over the preceding months. Factual, sequential, without editorial reach. The defense cross-examination took 4 hours across 2 days. They found every angle they could find. They questioned her characterization of events. They challenged her training documentation. They asked about the 2021 report and its suppression in a way designed to suggest that a nurse who had been involuntarily separated from the military had motivations beyond those of a neutral witness. She answered each question. She did not raise her voice. She did not qualify unnecessarily. When a question mischaracterized something she'd said or observed, she corrected it without apology. On the second day of cross-examination, the defense attorney, a sharp woman named Hollister, who was doing her job effectively and without malice, which Mara respected, asked, "Ms. Ellison, would you characterize yourself as a reliable witness, given that you had a professional grievance against one of the defendants?" Mara looked at her. "I had a documented injustice in my record that has since been officially corrected," she said. "Whether that constitutes a grievance is a question of framing. What I know is that I documented what I observed, told the truth in every statement I gave, and my testimony is consistent across all of them because it reflects what actually happened." She paused. The jury can assess reliability. That's their job. Hollister looked at her for a moment, something shifting in her expression that wasn't concession, but was adjacent to it, and moved to her next question. In the gallery, she could see from the corner of her eye Solis sitting in the third row. She hadn't known he was coming. She didn't look at him directly. She answered the last question and was excused and walked out of the witness stand and down the center aisle and through the courtroom doors, and the hallway outside was quiet and fluorescent and smelled of the specific bureaucratic air of federal buildings, and she stood in it for a minute and let her heart rate do what it needed to do. Victor Hale was convicted on 11 counts. Dayton Mercer, in a separate proceeding that accounted for his cooperation, pleaded guilty to 4 and received a sentence that the prosecution characterized as commensurate with the cooperation rendered. It was less than what the case might have warranted without the cooperation, which was the arrangement they'd made and which held. The 3 additional defendants, the Deputy Assistant Secretary, the contracting officer, the retired general, were convicted on charges that varied in count and severity, but that all carried sentences with real weight. The general's attorney tried to argue diminished accountability based on the chain of command structure. The jury deliberated for 3 days and returned verdicts that did not reflect sympathy for the argument. Victor Cade cooperated fully as agreed and was sentenced to 18 months on a reduced charge, with credit for time served during the proceedings. He would be out in less than a year. Mara read this in the summary Delaney sent and sat with the specific complexity of it. The man who had been the most dangerous person in the hospital corridor that night serving the shortest sentence, because what he'd had to offer the prosecution was more valuable than his punishment. That was how it worked. She didn't love it. She understood it. Garrett Pruitt, the internal analyst, pleaded guilty in a separate proceeding and was sentenced to 7 years. The sentencing for Hale was the last, and it was public, and it was covered extensively, and the number attached to it, 22 years, federal, no parole eligibility until 60% served, was reported by every major outlet with the specific gravity of a number that meant something. Mara read about it on her phone at the nurse's station at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, between rounds. She set the phone down. She thought about a man in a building in Washington in 2021, looking at a report she'd written and deciding that the cost of acknowledging it was higher than the cost of burying it. She thought about what he'd expected when he made that decision, that she would be quietly moved aside, that the report would stay buried, that the network he'd been protecting would continue operating, that the people above him in the chain of the fraud would continue to benefit from his management of the inconvenient things. She thought about how comprehensively every part of that expectation had been wrong, not because of her specifically, not because of any single person, because of Foss's 18 months of documentation and Cade's decision to cooperate in Solis's task force and Delaney's office and the Georgian Ministry of Justice and Briggs's partial security feed and a 24-year-old nurse named Priya who had locked a door and stayed in a room and not opened it until she heard the right voice. The work had been distributed across all of them in ways that couldn't be fully attributed after the fact. That was also worth understanding. Not as a diminishment of any single contribution, every piece had mattered, and several pieces had mattered critically, but as a corrective to the story that wanted to organize itself around one person's arc. Real accountability wasn't built by one person. It was built by the accumulated choices of multiple people who each decided, separately and under different pressures, to do the thing that the thing required. She picked up her rounds clipboard and went to check on room 114. Dayton Mercer came to Callaway Regional in April. Not as a patient. He drove himself. She saw the car in the lot from the window, the rental, not the kind of car she'd have associated with him, and came through the main entrance and asked at reception for Mara Ellison, and the reception coordinator paged her. She met him in the main lobby. He looked reduced, not small. He was still a tall man with the bearing of someone accustomed to occupying space. But the suit was less precise, and the silver hair had grown out unevenly, and there was something in his face that hadn't been there in the trauma bay, which was the specific texture of a man who had been made to see himself as others had seen him and had not enjoyed the view. He stood in the lobby with his hands loose at his sides, which for a man like him was the body language of someone who had left the armor elsewhere. "I wanted to come in person," he said. She looked at him. What I said in the trauma bay, he said. The way he stopped. I've thought about it. Specifically. Not as part of, he paused again. Not as part of a larger reckoning about the rest of it. Specifically that. What I said to you when your patient was dying in front of you. What do you want me to do with that? She said. Not unkindly, honestly. He absorbed this. I don't know, he said, which was the most honest thing she'd heard from him. I think I came because not coming felt worse. She looked at him for a moment. At the man who had been performing contempt in her trauma bay while coordinating the murder of a man she was keeping alive. At the separate fact that the contempt had been genuine even when it was also performance. The contempt you had for me in that room, she said. That wasn't because of who I was. It was because of what I looked like and what you assumed from it. She paused. You were wrong about what I was, but you would have been wrong to treat anyone the way you treated me that night, regardless of what they were. He met her eyes. She could see him receiving this, the specific cost of receiving it. Yes, he said, I know that. Then you have what you came for, she said. He nodded. He looked like he had more to say and had decided against it, which was possibly the first good decision she'd seen him make. He turned toward the door. She said, The patient you brought in, Raymond Foss. He stopped. He's going to be okay. I thought you should know that since you were there at the beginning. He turned back. Something moved across his face, complicated, not simple, not cleanly readable, and he nodded once. Then he left. She stood in the lobby for a moment and then went back to work. In May, she was running the first emergency response training session for the new resident cohort. 8 people in the simulation room, 4 of them medical residents and 4 nursing staff. A controlled scenario designed to test triage decision-making under time pressure. She'd built the scenario herself, which had taken 2 weeks and several conversations with Dr. Osei and a MedSim coordinator named Torres, who had the useful habit of pointing out when she was making things too hard before she could calibrate back. She stood at the front of the room and looked at the 8 people and said, The scenario starts when I start the clock. You have a mass casualty event, 5 patients, 2 critical. You have what's in this room. Go. She started the clock. What followed was instructive in the way simulations were instructive, revealing, uneven, full of small errors that were more useful than smooth performances would have been. The medical residents took longer than they should have to defer to the nursing staff on airway management, which was a pattern she'd expected and had built the scenario to surface. The nursing staff, conversely, hesitated on 2 decision points where they should have acted without waiting for physician direction, which was the other half of the same pattern seen from the other side. At the end of the scenario, she walked them through it. Not from the top. She started in the middle, at the moment where the pattern had been clearest. This moment, she said, pointing at the scenario board. The airway decision. 3 of you looked at each other for 4 seconds before anyone moved. In a real event, 4 seconds is sometimes the event. She looked at the residents and the nurses together. The knowledge in this room is not organized by title. It's organized by who knows what. Your job is to know what the person next to you knows, trust it, and use it. One of the medical residents, a young man named Park, sharp, and a little defensive in the way that sharp young people were often defensive, said, That's easier to say than to do in practice. Yes, she said. It is, which is why we're practicing. He looked at her. She could see him doing the thing that residents did when they were evaluating whether someone's authority warranted their attention. She was familiar with the process. She let it complete without helping it along. You've done this before, he said. The real version. Yes. In the army? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what's the actual difference between training and the real thing? She thought about this seriously, about the radiology corridor and the supply room and the chapel hallway floor and the mechanical room with a bleeding man and a man who needed to be contained, and all the training that had run underneath all of it like a current she hadn't had to consciously access. It had just been there. In training, she said, you know it's training, which means a part of your mind is always holding a small reservation, a small awareness that there's a floor underneath you. She paused. In the real thing, the floor is gone, and either you find out that the training is the floor or you find out that it isn't. She looked at the room. The only way to make the training the floor is to take it seriously enough that it becomes reflexive. That's what this room is for. Park nodded slowly. The defensive posture had moved somewhere else. She ran the scenario again. Tatik. She was at the East Wing nurses' station at 11:15 p.m. on a Tuesday in late May, the end of a long shift, writing the last of her handover notes when Priya appeared beside her. Priya was almost at the end of her first year. She'd grown into the work in the specific, uneven way that people grew into it, still uncertain in the places where uncertainty was honest, more capable in the places where capability was built, less flinching in the moments that had previously made her flinch. "Can I ask you something?" Priya said. "Go ahead." "Why do you stay on nights?" Mara looked up from her notes. The question was genuine, not rhetorical. She thought about it honestly. About the specific quality of hospitals at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning, when the institution ran on its fundamentals and the ambient noise of daytime, the visitors, the procedures, the administrative current of a building at full operation, went quiet, and what was left was the work itself. The patients in their rooms, doing the vulnerable and unobserved business of being ill and being cared for and sometimes being frightened about whether they would still be here in the morning. She stayed because those hours were the truest version of what the job was. Because the people who needed someone at 3 in the morning needed a particular kind of presence. Not intervention, not management, just the steady fact of someone being there and paying attention. Because she was good at that presence and had been good at it before she understood what it was. "Because this is where the work is," she said. Priya considered this. "Even after everything that happened, you could do something else, Solis's office, or—" "I know," Mara said, "but you chose this." "I chose this," she said. Again. Priya nodded slowly. She looked at the nurses' station, at the screens and the charts and the hallway behind them, where 7 patients were doing the ordinary work of getting through the night. "I think I understand that," she said. "Give it another year," Mara said. "Then tell me." Priya smiled, which she didn't do often on shift, but did now, and went to check on room 121. Mara finished her handover notes. She documented carefully because careful documentation was the difference between information that was useful and information that was lost, and she had learned that lesson at a cost she would not repeat. She wrote what she'd observed, what she'd done, what the next shift needed to know to continue the work she was handing off. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, as if it mattered, because it did. She capped her pen and gathered her things and walked toward the exit, and the May night outside was cool and clear, the sky above Decker Falls doing what Montana sky did, which was take up more space than you expected and remind you without sentimentality of your actual scale in relation to everything around you. She had been underestimated in this building and in others before it. She had been dismissed and pushed aside and had her name on a report that was buried and spent 3 years carrying the weight of a wrong that had no immediate mechanism for correction. She had been a nurse in a trauma bay, while a man in an expensive suit demanded someone more qualified, and she had been a nurse in a mechanical room, and a utility corridor, and a chapel hallway, and an operating theater, and a simulation room, and 100 patient rooms at 3 in the morning, and all of it had been the same job done with everything she had. The job hadn't required anyone to understand what she was to let her do it. The doing had been available regardless. That was the thing they didn't tell you, or maybe told you and assumed you'd forget, which was the same as not telling you, about work that mattered. It didn't wait for permission. You either did it or you didn't, and the circumstances and the recognition and the titles and the judgments of the people around you were real and had consequences, but they were not the thing. The thing was the work. The thing was showing up and doing it even when the people in the room had already decided what you were. She had done that. She had kept doing it, and the doing had turned out to be enough. Not because everything had resolved cleanly, because it hadn't, but because she was still here, still capable, still needed, still choosing it. She walked to her car in the May dark and drove home through the empty streets of Decker Falls, and the lights of the hospital were visible behind her in the rearview mirror for most of the drive. And then she turned a corner, and they weren't, and she didn't look back.